In the military camp not far from the mountains, there was a loud banging of metal objects. One of the men ordered everyone to get up for breakfast. A muscular young man in a black t-shirt was lying on his bed and fast asleep. As soon as he heard a loud sound, he immediately woke up. Also, a man woke up next to him, who immediately reached for his shoes. In one of his boots, he found something incomprehensible. He shouted loudly, angry at the insect that was in his shoe. A young man named Enkrid did not like it because he wanted to sleep some more. Literally after a few minutes, this man and several other young men rose to their feet. They began to warm up in preparation for a hard day. The fighters in this incomprehensible squad were completely different. Someone woke up and immediately started praying. Enkrid was the commander of all these fools. He himself called them that because he did not really want to stay in this place. One of his charges was still sleeping soundly, not about to wake up. One of the men had already gone outside and sat comfortably on a box near the tent. He was preparing weapons all day. Before sunset, a squad of warriors met their enemies, and the leader, raising his spear to the highest point, ordered his wards to immediately begin the battle. Enkrid shouted with all his might, "Open the latitude wide." He did not have any special strength, but he never gave up in the face of difficulties. A whole horde of soldiers in armor rushed into battle after the order of their commander. They raised their spears and swords as they faced the enemy. Enkrid got into this squad only because of his endless training. Now he was proving his strength in action, facing the knights. Approaching the enemy, the young man delivered a powerful kick to the chest, knocking his enemy several meters back. He no longer threatened him. However, danger crept up from behind in the form of another enemy. The helmeted knight grabbed Enkrid by the waist, handcuffing him. After that, the enemy knocked the young man to the floor, unable to get up. He punched until Enkrid was able to stand up. Suddenly, one of the young man's wards noticed that the commander was in danger. He immediately rushed to help and cut off the head of the murderer. Enkrid was infinitely grateful to fate for his salvation. He immediately began to get to his feet and reach for his sword to continue the fight. The young man quickly moved from his place and headed in the direction of the opponents, covering his head with his sword from the constant danger from above. In the ranks of the enemy squad, there were archers who were stationed at a distance and constantly released arrows to make the enemy's life seem more difficult. One of these arrows aimed straight at the man who had saved Enkrid on the battlefield. An arrow landed in his face and the man fell to the floor. The leader continued to run forward and did not understand what was happening. He ordered his ward to run forward, regardless of the problems. Turning his head back, Enkrid saw that his savior was lying motionless on the floor, covered in blood. He understood that this was the end of the man's earthly journey. Suddenly, the young man came back to reality and saw an enemy in front of him, who was rapidly approaching him, holding a weapon in his hands. Enkrid always believed that as long as he held the sword in his hands, he would not give up his dream and become a knight. So at such a moment, he grabbed the hilt again. However, his dream was cut short. The speed of the leader was not enough to block this blow. The enemy turned out to be much faster and stronger. The sharp blade of the sword hit the young man right in the neck. He suddenly stopped breathing and realized that his life would end in a second. Enkrid coughed and began spitting blood from his mouth. His vocal cords were severed. Blood continuously flowed from the neck. After a few seconds, the leader fell helplessly to the floor, resting on his knees. He dropped his sword, which landed right in front of the warrior's face. After that, Enkrid began to lean forward, losing consciousness. The fighter did not even imagine how pitifully he would meet his death. Suddenly, somewhere in the depths of his soul, the young man felt that he was not dead. He saw a purple light in front of him, which gave some hope for life. Enkrid opened his tired eyes and looked at the floor. He had no idea where he was, still reeling from the events of the battlefield. He saw in front of him a very blurry picture, which was shimmering with purple colors and did not give any information about his location. The young man was incredibly sweaty after his long adventures. He continued to look at the floor, and the picture in his eyes became clearer. Enkrid was in the subconscious, where he stood in exactly the position in which he died. Circles formed from his bodies on the water. Some of them grew larger as they moved away from the young man. Suddenly, Enkrid woke up again in his bed. He heard the loud clanking of metal objects that heralded the start of the day. A man woke up next to him and took his boots in his hands. He looked into one of them and was a little surprised to find a small object inside. He turned the boot upside down and threw out a small insect. His expression suggested that the soldier was not very fond of insects. Enkrid looked at the man with horror in his eyes. It was déjà vu, which was difficult to believe even for someone who had just died. The day repeated itself with incredible precision. The leader, together with his squad, found himself on the battlefield and now faced an unequal battle with several opponents. Suddenly, the young man noticed danger behind him and immediately turned back. He saw the sword coming towards him with incredible speed. Encred again did not have time to react to the danger, and the sword ended up in his throat. The young man once again experienced this unpleasant moment, feeling unbearable pain. The sword pierced through his neck, revealing its blade from the other side. Encred lost again and failed, losing his dream. Waking up on the second day, the events of that day were repeated again. Encred spent a whole day on the battlefield and was finally killed again. This happened every day. A cook with a frying pan and a ladle woke the soldiers, informing them of the imminent encounter with the enemy today. Encred woke up every day with a look of horror on his face. He held his hands around his neck and remembered how yesterday he had already passed through inevitable death. The tribute was repeated over and over. The squad found itself on the battlefield and once again was ready to face its opponents face to face. Encred was not happy about this because every day he experienced unbearable pain in the throat area. Now he was in danger again. The young man had already turned his head back and saw approaching him the same man who always leaves him dead on the battlefield. This time the enemy redirected his sword and pushed off the ground, standing an arm's length away from his victim whose back was turned. Encred turned to face his opponent and looked at him with frightened eyes. It was not difficult to guess what was waiting for him this time. The young man was tired of constantly experiencing the same emotions. With a sinister look, he looked at his opponent, intending to change the course of events on the battlefield. Encred again saw the enemy in front of him, pointing his sword in his direction. The opponent moved forward relentlessly, delivering a perfect blow. The young man perfectly understood this, as well as the fact that he would not be able to dodge this blow. His death became inevitable day by day. Encred closed his eyes and for the 17th time resigned himself to the fact that he would not meet death again, since he had no time to avoid the attack. The opponent pierced his body through again, showing the blade from the other side. The captain of the second-rate detachment could not do anything again. Encred felt incredible anger from the fact that for the 17th time, he was experiencing unbearable emotions and pain that made him spit blood. The young man repeatedly tried to swing his sword with greater speed and power, but each time he was defeated in battle. He fell powerlessly to the floor again, resting his knees on the ground and lowering his sword. Having dealt with the young man, the enemy slowly moved away from him. Encred remained lying on the ground, covered in blood. A huge puddle formed under him, and the fighters around him continued to fight. The young man found himself in his subconscious and thought about whether he could not avoid death. He just needed to get stronger. Suddenly, Encred saw completely different colors in his subconscious. Not far from him hung a lantern that glowed in dark blue colors. The young man slowly opened his eyes and heard an unfamiliar voice asking him if he really thought he would be able to stay alive on that fateful day. At the moment when Encred began to rise to his feet, a boat floated behind him. On board sat a ghost with the same lantern in his hands. Dry lips and face gave the stranger a frightening appearance. He turned to the young man, once again reminding him of the irreversible defeat. Encred was once again reminded that he literally crawled out of his skin to achieve his goal, but still ended up a failure. The young man did not like such words very much. He became incredibly angry and promised himself that he could not just leave this day. He woke up again to the sound of a pan and ladle. Such sounds greeted the young man every day and did not seem strange to him. Encred opened his eyes again this morning and was no longer surprised that he was living the same day. He was used to exactly the same dark details. The man sleeping next to the commander noticed that the young man had woken up early today. This was the first difference with the past lived days. Encred decided to warn his ward, whose name was Rem, that he had an insect in one of his boots, which he feared to death. Rem did not believe his commander at first and decided to check everything with his own eyes. With incredible curiosity, the man looked into one of his boots. Seeing that there was indeed a small black spot inside, Rem turned his boot over and an insect fell out. He could not understand how she ended up there. Throwing the insect to the floor, Rem immediately swung his leg and stepped on the innocent animal with all his might, taking its life. Rem was indignant and asked the commander how he knew about the insect. The man assumed that the young man was playing a joke on him and threw this small animal on purpose. However, everything was completely different. Encred turned to face his ward and said that he had just seen insects crawling into his boot this morning. The young man spoke of insects in the plural, for it was the 18th time he had seen the poor dead animal that ended up in Rem's boot every morning. Having quickly dressed, the commander headed for the exit. He raised the tent above him and wondered if he could change this fateful day today. Stepping forward, Encred remembered his young self when he first picked up a sword. He immediately liked it, and from that day, he started training. After a few months, he found a teacher who was a former mercenary soldier. He ended up in the village completely by accident and agreed to be a teacher. After Ankrid knocked his teacher to the floor for the first time, even though he didn't have a left leg, the man praised the young man. He told him that with such skills, Ankrid could one day become a knight. This is how the dream was born, which the young man has not been able to give up until now. He constantly thought about brave men who could single-handedly cope with a horde of opponents and turn the tide of battle in their favor. In the young man's imagination, the knight was an invincible hero who always helps his wards and starts bloody wars. Ankrid had a dream to become the main character, a knight who would be able to end the war, and people would call him the Knight of the End. That is why the young man left his village and went on a journey. Having met the first partners, the young man was not very pleased because they mocked him. The men drank beer in the tractor and laughed at the young warrior who was afraid even of dogs. They knew perfectly well that this poor fellow would not become a knight. Ankrid was sitting opposite and bandaged his wounds on his hand and face. After a few weeks, the young man realized that his talent did not surprise anyone outside the village. However, he wasn't going to get his hopes up. Ankrid understood that nothing would ever work out the first time, so he accepted his mistake as absolutely normal. Every day, he went to the training ground and trained to control the sword. The young man understood that thanks to hard work, he would be able to catch up with the most talented fighters. Literally, after a few weeks, the work has already begun to bear fruit. Ankrid left his first squad of losers and was able to show everyone his skills. He overcame all his difficulties by traveling the world. The young man constantly practiced with his sword, which served as his faithful friend. Ankrid grew up very quickly and never for a moment was separated from his sword. Now he swung his weapon to deliver the final blow. His victim was a huge snake that he met in the forest. It was a strong opponent for the young man, who eventually won the fight. In a few years, Ankrid gained experience and earned the recognition of those around him, demonstrating his strength, courage, and incredible endurance. The young man became stronger literally every day, not stopping at anything. Every day he believed more and more that he could become a knight. However, one fine day, his hope again crashed to the ground. This happened when the warrior returned to his native village. Here he met an opponent who surpassed him in strength. The young man was simply shocked when he felt the sword touch his chest. It all happened when one boy from the village challenged him to a duel. Ankrid could not resist the boy and was unquestionably defeated in this duel. The boy was only 12 years old. He took the sword 6 months ago, and already he was able to prove that Ankrid is absolutely nothing compared to him. It was incredibly insulting to the young man because he gave in to his problems through sweat and blood, trying to control his sword for more than 10 years. It turned out that it was all in vain. The young man turned out to be an absolute badass in front of the boy, who has been practicing for only 6 months even without a teacher. Ankrid fell helplessly to his knees and turned to his subconscious. He could not believe that all his efforts would be in vain. The mere thought of not fulfilling his dream made Ankrid go mad. He was very angry with himself for not being able to change anything. In the end, after each such situation, the young man calmed down and continued to move on. He looked to a bright future where he wields a sword as a knight. Ankrid did not give up in the face of any difficulties and constantly rose, continuing his training. He found a new training ground for himself every time. The young man swung his sword with all his might, carving patterns on the wood. At that moment, he remembered the boy who had dared to call him an idiot. Ankrid spent the whole night around the trunk of an old tree. The sun had already begun to rise, and the young man did not close his eyes for a second and did not even eat anything. Despite this, he was full of energy. This energy and strength gave him the dream that one day he would still become a knight. Ankrid continued to train and cut wood with his sword, despite the fatigue and sleepiness that made itself felt every second. His hands were incredibly tired, which was visible from the blade of the sword, which began to shake at the moment when the warrior held the sword steady. Ankrid was very tired after more than 12 hours of training. His endurance was indeed incredible, but certainly not infinite. Looking towards the high mountains, the young man noticed how the sun broke its first rays through the horizon, smoothly illuminating the surrounding area. Only now did the warrior realize that he had spent the whole night near the tree. His eyes looked incredibly tired and his skin continued to drip unceasingly. Ankrid looked at his target for tonight and saw the results of his training. The tree was completely cut down but still standing. Ankrid also stood in front of the trunk of this tree, bent down. He was holding a sword in his hands and could barely continue training. The young man was breathing very heavily, but he was not even going to stop. He gave himself a few minutes to rest, but he did not finish the training there. Taking a breath, Ankrid once again took the hilt of his sword with both hands and swung from behind, preparing to continue his endless strikes. The young man believed that training to exhaustion would help him become the knight he always dreamed of being. With each blow, he seemed to be getting closer to his dream. Gritting his teeth, Ankrid held back his fatigue and continued to strike, thinking that he would be able to become at least a valiant warrior in the near future. The young man lacked the stamina and strength to continue training, but he was not going to stop for a second and hid his inner emotions. Gathering all his strength into his fist, Ankrid gripped the sword as hard as he could and let out a loud cry, as if preparing to engage in real combat. After that, the young man hit the nose with a powerful sword, piercing the trunk of the tree right through. Yes, he continued training for several years. And 3 years later, Ankrid found himself in the same division called Sirius. 4 platoons and 4 companies took part in this battle. Ankrid became the commander of one of the second-rate units that were subordinate to the Supreme Command and could not decide anything on their own. This morning, Ankrid approached one of his wards named Jackson. A man was sitting on a box near the tent and sharpening his knife. Jackson was very surprised to see his commander next to him. He looked at him with an interested look and asked if something had happened today. Ankrid approached his ward every day and asked him to take turns in his place, as he had to prepare for an incredibly difficult battle. Jackson answered his captain with a displeased look every day. He did not really want to be on duty since it was the most boring job. In the end, Ankrid promised the ward a reward for this service, and after that Jackson would get up from his seat and go to work. Rem constantly emphasized that Jackson is a very slippery person. He warned his commander to be more careful with this man. Ankrid suddenly spoke to another of his charges. Rem asked if the commander wanted to transfer some of his other duties to him. The young man replied that there was no need for this. He looked at his ward with a serious look and said that he wanted to learn one technique. Rem looked with curiosity and arrogance at his commander, who wanted to learn how to use the heart of the beast and did not understand why he needed it. Rem knew very well that his commander was not distinguished by his courage and strength, so he asked the young man if he was sure of his decision. Every time, Ankrid approached the big man and asked him for training. The commander was bending because he was forced to prepare for a battle with an enemy division. Ankrid said goodbye to life in the battle between Norilia and Azpan. This time it started again, and the young man could not do anything about his death. He came back to life each time, and Rem taught him a technique called the heart of the beast, living the same day over and over again. Despite all his efforts, the captain of the second-rate squad could not resist his enemy, who repeatedly cut his throat. Ankrid constantly tried to look at the blade of the sword, but it did not bear any fruit, and the enemy was stronger and even more impetuous. This evening, 4 companies and 4 platoons gathered again for the war with Azeron. They lined up at sunrise in front of the high mountains in native columns. There was simply an incredible number of fighters. They were divided into separate squads, which were separated from each other by a distance of several meters. Absolutely every warrior on the battlefield understood that he could only rely on himself. When the commander gave the order to attack, everyone shouted loudly and rushed into battle. It was the 21st time Ankrid lived on the same day. This time he prepared himself again, but he didn't know what this battle would lead to. In a few minutes, the battlefield turned into a real cemetery. Ankrid fought with his enemies, waiting for the same fatal moment. Suddenly, he saw behind him a spear that was launched in his direction. Ankrid had seen him 21 times, so he was not at all surprised. The young man studied every detail on the battlefield and was able to easily dodge the danger that passed within inches of his throat. After that, Ankrid would always turn his back to the main battlefield and block another blow from behind. He did it as if according to some instructions. And so, finally, the commander of the second-rate squad moved on to the main event of the day. Now his attention was directed in one direction only. Turning his head back, Ankrid saw in front of him one of the members of his squad named Vel, who continued to resist the enemies. It was the same man who had saved him from death the first time, and then died from an arrow landing on his forehead. Ankrid knew perfectly well the course of events on the battlefield, and saw the arrow rapidly approaching in the direction of Val and finish him off second by second. This time, the young man decided to change the course of events on the battlefield. He quickly stood around his ward and blocked a blow that threatened to kill him. However, the danger for Vel did not stop there. The enemy took advantage of the fact that the man diverted his attention to the arrow and attacked him from behind. Val just threw his frightened look behind him and screamed loudly, preparing to die. The man understood that no one would save him now. However, one man on the battlefield was of a different opinion. Ankrid once again managed to save his ward, cutting the enemy's body in half. The young man accomplished his first goal to date. He had saved Vel and could now switch to the man who remained his main target. The enemy in armor and a broadsword cut his enemies to pieces. He spared absolutely no one, piercing bodies through and through. His sword laid down a great many bodies on this battlefield. Each time the man took his sword and the blood that belonged to various victims dripped from it. In a few minutes he finished off 5 of his opponents. He removed his sword from the victim's body, and now the next duel was waiting for him. Each time Encred looked into the face of his opponent and cursed him. More than 20 times his life ended with this fight. Leaving his dead opponents in his wake, the helmeted man began striding confidently forward, approaching his next target. Of course, it turned out to be a young man who stood motionless. Encred did not take a single step before meeting the enemy in his own territory. The young man clenched his sword in his hand and focused on the enemy's movements. He understood that this time he needed to make even more efforts. The opponent moved from his place and, pushing off the ground, found himself next to his enemy and with a smile on his face was ready to cut him. At that moment, Encred remembered the words of his ward, Remus, who was throwing the axe up and telling his commander about his main weakness. Rima constantly threw the weapon up and caught it again in his hands, choosing the right moment to demonstratively attack his commander. At the most unexpected moment, the man swung his axe and hit his commander on the head with all his might to explain all his weaknesses. Encred closed his eyes to the feeling of death, and Rem pointed out that the commander would die very quickly on the battlefield if he kept doing this. Strovan advised the young man to be braver and not to panic on the battlefield. In his opinion, the commander should have become someone who does not know what death is. Encred lived this moment every day and understood his main weakness, but he could not overcome it on the battlefield, constantly closing his eyes. Rem glared into his commander's face and told him to act like a beast who had no time to think on the battlefield. Encred returned to reality and saw before him mortal danger. His fateful rival was ready to tear his throat. The young man drew air to his lungs and moved from his place, meeting the blade of the enemy's sword right in front of his face, without closing his eyes. Encred seemed to slow time down and stared at his opponent's bloodied hand, wondering if he looked like a beast now. The young man stopped and tried to understand himself. He looked at the lasso and asked himself if he was afraid of death for the 21st time. Opening his eyes wide, Encred gave a clear answer that death made him stronger and not to be feared after so many encounters. By using the beast heart technique, Encred was able to turn the events of the battlefield in a different direction. He dodged the fateful blow for the 21st time. It was still difficult for the young man to believe in this course of events. He was looking at the blade, which passed literally in a matter of millimeters from his neck. At this moment, the captain's heart was beating with the speed of a frightened animal. It sensed the moment when the master finally saved his life. Encred was able to avoid this blow for the first time. The enemy was simply shocked because he was absolutely sure that the young man would not be able to evade this attack. The young man looked at his opponent with a confident look, as if informing him that this time, the conditions on the battlefield would be dictated by him. The opponent looked at the young man with a frightened look after the failed attack and understood that he needed to prepare for the opponent's counterattack. Encred, immediately after the successful defense, grabbed the hilt of his sword with all his might and swung to end the scum once and for all. The enemy had already recovered from the last miss and twisted the sword in his hands, intending to counterattack the young man at the moment of impact. Encred paid absolutely no attention to any of his opponent's movements and was only focused on his weapon, which needed to be delivered to the opponent's heart. The young man let out a loud cry before delivering the final blow. For a few seconds, he believed that his suffering would finally end on the 21st day. However, the conclusions were hasty. Encred suddenly noticed the blade of the sword, which was again at his throat. He did not notice the danger. Encred immediately paid for his life mistake. The enemy cut the young man's throat again when he tried to counterattack him. Encred again felt unbearable pain in the throat area and could not move the ligaments. This was a sign of another defeat of the young man on the battlefield. Suddenly, he found himself in his subconscious again and saw in front of him a boat moving with the help of an oar near one of the brothers. The ghost on the boat continued to swim forward with the lantern in hand. He explained to the young man that he was trapped in this endless day. Dry Lips told the young man to come to the boat and sit inside. The voice spoke as quietly and calmly as possible, continuing to swim. He advised the young man to admit his weakness and be as calm as possible. Encred was sitting in a puddle of water, leaning on his knees and looking at the floor. He disagreed with the ghost around him and became very angry. He did not want to obey his words and was going to prove that he was not weak at all. This morning, the young man woke up again to the sound of metal objects, thinking that last time he saw the blade of an enemy sword with his own eyes. The same man was again stationed to the left of the commander. Rem was putting on his boot and talking to the commander, who woke up earlier today. This time, Encred said nothing to his charge and looked confidently ahead, preparing to fight for his 22nd time. The battle began again, and the warriors began to cut each other to pieces. Somewhere among this company lurked one very interesting young man. Encred faced death 33 times. Now he clearly saw the movements of his opponent and could at least counter him with something. The young man managed to dodge the enemy's first blow, just like last time. He outran the enemy and remained alive. Now, the commander of the second-rate squad faced a new task. He had to dodge faster than the enemy would cut his throat a second time. Despite his best efforts, Encred was unable to achieve his goal. The enemy cut his throat again when he tried to attack him. The young man had to admit that the man was too fast to fight him now. Encred needed many hours of training before this fight. Now he was once again defeated and fell helplessly to his knees. Blood slowly dripped onto the floor, symbolizing an undeniable defeat. At the moment when the bloodshed reached its maximum point, Encred began to lose consciousness and fall to the ground. The necklace on his face broke. It was a small round pendant of a bright blue color, reminiscent of outer space where comets are constantly moving, passing by the stars. Encred was previously forced to work as a mercenary. One day he went to the forest and completed a task, after which he barely remained alive. He took several orders to subdue monsters and killed forest animals with his sword, risking his life and his dream. Encred did it not at all of his own volition. He just once came across a random village where he was asked for help. The reason why the young man decided to help this village is his dream. He very much wanted to become a knight, and helping the weak is his credo. After Encred fulfilled such an order, the elder of the village rewarded him with an artifact, which he placed in the hand of their savior. The young man was generally surprised that this poor village could offer him something. The old man said that was all they could give him. Glancing at his hand, Encred saw a bright blue amulet that reminded him of a globe. He did not understand why he needed this decoration at all. Of course, it was a ridiculous reward for risking his life, but the elder emphasized that this amulet would be able to repay him with his own dream. Encred was lying on the ground, choking on blood and looking at this amulet. He overlooked that it is possible that this day is repeated over and over again because of him. It was such repetitions that could help him become a knight. Suddenly, the young man's thoughts were interrupted by his enemy noticing his opponent still alive. The enemy approached the young man and mercilessly raised his sword up. The man said that he would show mercy and end his opponent's life very quickly. Encred was not very pleased with this turn of events. He tried to get to his feet, but the huge loss of blood made itself felt. He looked at his opponent with a sinister look and wanted to tell the man to push his mercy away, but the vocal cords were cut. The helmeted enemy stared mercilessly at the young man holding a sword in front of his face. One could read sinister intentions in his eyes. Before making the last movement with the sword, the man smiled sinisterly and said that mercy to his opponents would surely bring him victory. After that, the man killed the young man, who died on the floor. Encred called the man a common murderer who enjoyed the death of other people. The next day, the young man woke up again to the sound of metal objects. He once again met his death and did not want to listen to this nonsense. Encred had bandaged his hands this morning and told his charge bluntly that he had thrown an insect into his boot for a bit of fun. Rem immediately checked his commander's joke and it turned out to be true. Turning the boot over, the man saw an insect fall out. Rem was very angry with the young man for his sense of humor. He asked why it was necessary to arrange some incomprehensible jokes from the very morning. Encred had crushed the insect with his own hand this morning and ordered his charge to gather immediately and stop asking incomprehensible questions. Turning his confident face back, the second-rate unit commander told his charge that he would be teaching him the beast heart technique today. Rem looked at his commander in great surprise. He did not understand why he was in such a hurry, because such things were not characteristic of the young man. In the end, the man was forced to follow his commander's orders and went outside to practice a little with the weak young man. Rem held several master classes, after which the allies sparred so that Encred could master a similar technique as quickly as possible. The young man constantly watched the movements of his ward and tried to increase his speed by avoiding dangerous blows from Rem. The man continued to advance and swing his hammers. Encred was not even going to counterattack and kept retreating, dodging blows. The young man had mastered this kind of situation well in his life, and had to admit that Rem was much slower than his fiercest opponent on the battlefield. As he continued to attack, Rem watched his commander's movements closely and was very surprised as his skills had improved significantly since yesterday. After sparring, Rem asked the young man how he was able to master such moves so quickly. Encred replied that he just practiced a lot. Looking at the serious face of the young man, The man denied that no person could master his family's equipment in such a short period of time. Encred decided to end this dialogue and turned his back to the interlocutor, assuming that he just happened to repeat the technique of his ward's family. The young man went to the place where they were stacking weapons and took a sword. At this moment, he thought about the fact that Rem really had a very good sense of the enemy. Turning his face back and putting his sword in front of him, the squad leader invited his charge to engage in sparring once more. Rem was watching his commander carefully all this time and did not understand what was happening at all. He didn't expect Encred to ever want to do something like that. Zdrovan liked such things, so he simply could not afford to give up such a pleasure, and he also had the opportunity to help the commander. Rem entered the sparring first and delivered several powerful blows, which Encred dodged with great difficulty. He admitted he became a big man much faster. After all, after a few seconds, the young man got used to the speed of his opponent. He waved his head in different directions, avoiding a collision with the enemy's weapon. Rem continued to press his opponent all the time, closing the distance. Zdrovan asked the commander if he was going to just dodge all the time. Encred understood that just now he did not possess any technique that could injure even his ward, let alone enemies. The young man was only able to dodge the blows and hide the secret technique for later. This technique was Valen's mercenary sword technique. Encred clenched his teeth tightly and remembered the anomalous technique that was created by a mercenary who was able to make himself famous under the name of Valen. The young man planted his foot firmly on the floor. Some spoke rather negatively about the anomalous technique, calling it an ordinary small focus. Rem continued to press his opponent and noticed that the lower part of the commander's body looked weak, so he could not win this fight. However, Encred had a completely different opinion on this account. The young man pushed off the ground with all his might, preparing for his counterattack. With his left foot, he planted himself firmly on the ground, and with his right, he pushed himself off the floor, firmly holding the hilt of the sword with his right hand. Rem, at this point, continued to move towards his opponent and was completely shocked to see what the squad leader was showing him. Encred copied the movement of his opponent, who killed him again and again on the battlefield with the same blow, pushing off the ground. The young man clearly remembered every move of his enemy as he had seen him a large number of times. Now he decided to use it on his own experience. Despite good speed and strength, the commander's attack was unsuccessful. Rem was able to easily knock the sword out of the leader's hands with his axe. Encred was disarmed and his sword flew several meters back and landed, making several turns on the bare ground. The young man looked at his hand and could not believe what he had just done. He almost managed to catch his ward off guard. Encred for a few seconds imitated the blow of a scumbag who enjoyed killing people and finished him off several times. The young man clenched his right fist in his hand and assumed that his body had memorized these movements, as he had died from a particular blow more than 20 times. After sparring, Rem decided to say a few words, but Encred couldn't understand him. He absolutely did not know how to explain greetings. At first, he admitted that this strike was the most dignified a commander had ever shown, but he still noticed some flaws. Rem explained that the young man's hand should bleed during the blow and demonstrated in practice. Encred looked at the ward and still does not understand anything. Zdrovan scratched the back of his head and tried to formulate a thought. According to him, the young man's main problem was self-doubt. The squad commander looked at his ward with a confident look and began to catch his train of thought. It was definitely a useful sparring session. Holding the axe in front of him, Rem said that the commander should stick to the idea that he can't dodge, so it's better to take the hit. Encred stood motionless, his right fist clenched. With some surprise, he looked at the man trying to connect two words. Despite the fact that Rem explained the information was quite specific, the squad commander managed to catch his thought and organize it in his head. Rem tried to explain the main difference between his commander's punch and the bastard's punch, who always came out victorious in their duels. Encred could not understand anything until this moment. His throat was constantly in pain, and this was the end of his earthly journey time and time again. After training with Rem, the young man realized that his main problem was confidence with the sword, which his enemy certainly did not lack. The man again put the blade of the sword in front of him and began to speak about mercy, which did not make Encred any easier in this situation. Having uttered the last words, the enemy again dealt a fatal blow with a sword to the back of the young man, who was helplessly covered in blood on the bare ground. Waking up the next morning, Encred began sparring with his charge again. Now he knew where he needed to go. The young man delivered a much more successful blow, but Rem was still too strong for him and easily knocked out the sword that flew into the air. A few hours later, the squad captain again faced his fateful rival, who won the match and again said something about mercy. Ankrid tried to get to his feet at the last moment, but the opponent did not allow him to do so and pierced his throat again, taking his life. Each time and each awakening, the young man trained with his ward and honed his skills to one day win the fateful duel. Ankrid was completely helpless on the battlefield and constantly received a blow to the throat, which was his last. The young man was forced to constantly listen to words of mercy while lying on the ground. He always ended up with the match stuck in his throat. Ankrid passed 111 attempts but still had no success on the battlefield. His throat was hurt again in the fight and he almost gave up. On the 123rd day, nothing has changed again. The enemy used his sword for a quick strike and pierced the young man's throat again, leaving him to die. Ankrid did not understand what he was doing wrong. He tried his best in morning training, but it did not give him any success. Despite this, on the 124th time of his awakening, the young man again began sparring with his ward to master the skills as best as possible. Rem lived a day without memories every time, so time after time he was simply shocked at how much stronger Ankrid had become in one day. 124 times was not an exception, and the man could not believe his eyes at all. He narrowly dodged the captain's blow, which could have cut him in half. Ankrid looked down and just continued sparring. He didn't pay attention to how Rem was trying to avoid him. After finishing today's sparring, the big man turned to the squad captain and asked if he had lost his mind after tonight. Opposite him stood a young man with a sword in his hands. Holding onto the hilt, he gripped the sword tightly in his hands, causing it to bleed suddenly. With every second, the amount of blood only increased. Remus immediately noticed that his captain's arms were broken and needed rest. Besides, Ankrid was laughing like a madman. While Rem was in complete shock, the young man was glad in his heart that he had finally mastered the blow of his fiercest opponent. The next day, the young man had the opportunity to test his shot in real combat. He tried to give his all and be faster than the opponent. Ankrid was looking at his opponent with the gaze of a killer and was about to attack him with a powerful blow as Rem had taught him. The young man attacked the enemy with a sword, holding the weapon in front of him. He did it as quickly as possible, without giving his opponent a chance to think. Despite this, the enemy somehow evaded this danger. The sword struck him on the helmet, but did not touch any part of the body. Instead, Ankrid was struck again by his opponent's sword, and a wound opened on his neck. Another attempt of the young man turned out to be unsuccessful. Despite this, the young man was not upset. He fought back the pain with all his might. Blood flowed from his throat in a river and fell to the ground. Ankrid tested himself for strength and tried not to blink in the face of death. He strictly followed the instructions of his ward Rem. In addition, the young man promised himself that he would never drop the sword on the floor. He gripped the hilt in his right hand and continued to stand with the weapon. The enemy was not going to just look at the young man, so he immediately knocked him to the floor and pressed his foot to the ground, striking him in the chest. A sinister smile appeared on the killer's face. He looked at his victorious opponent and assumed that he must be in a lot of pain right now. After that, the man raised his sword above his head and again began to tell his tales of mercy, intending to finish off the enemy. Ankrid lay motionless on the ground without any possibility of escape. Meanwhile, in the background, the battle between the opposing sides continued. Suddenly, the killer was simply shocked when he heard the young man's voice. Despite having his throat cut, Ankrid found the strength to say a few words. Looking into the opponent's face with a serious look, the young man said with confidence that he would be able to kill his opponent tomorrow. Hearing the words of his opponent, the killer only laughed at him. An ominous smile appeared on his face, which spoke of incredible relief. The man finally said that the dead cannot live until tomorrow. After that, he pierced the opponent's body, leaving him lifeless. It was at such moments that the dark blue artifact was triggered. He was responsible for the fact that Ankrid was able to return to life again and again. The next morning, the young man woke up before everyone else and immediately took the boot of his ward. He turned it over and shook the insect out. After that, the commander of the secondary squad stepped on the insect with his right foot with all his might, crushing it. Today, he was very serious. Rem was just shocked and silently watched this performance. Ankrid explained to his ward that he had seen an insect crawl into his boot. The man thanked the commander, after which the young man offered his ward to thank him and take on the duties of security today. Rem couldn't understand what was going on with the commander. The usually docile young man somehow started giving orders too confidently. 125 Ankrid's attempt began. He set out on an adventure and met a ward on his way who had bright red hair. The commander ordered him to find armor, a shield, and a dagger for him and promised to pay later. The boy was a little skeptical about this order. In the end, he decided to agree and said that he would be able to do as ordered. Rem, at that moment, approached the boy and was surprised how the commander was talking to him as well. At this moment, Jackson was sitting on a box near the ward and called his partners weaklings, who put all their service on the squad commander. Rem was incredibly eager to test his axe in this conflict, but now was not the best time as they had much more important things to do. Zudrovan looked at his commander and wondered what had happened to him. Usually the young man was kinder and less tense. After giving orders to his wards, Enkrid went to practice with his sword. One of the trees in the forest became his punching bag for today. The young man was venting all his anger and the incredible pain he felt every time he died at the hands of a scoundrel on a real battlefield. He even thought that he would never be able to defeat his opponent. Enkrid wondered if he could somehow avoid this duel. At some point, the squad commander calmed down his emotions and gathered his strength. He realized that he was now much stronger than he was before. Enkrid had already chosen his path and was not going to deviate from it. He showed all his courage and thought that he should follow the path drawn for himself. Even if there was a wall in the form of an opponent on his way, which he could not break through, Enkrid was still ready for such difficulties. All he needed to do now was sharpen his skills for tonight's match, so he began to have nightmares about the tree trunk. The poor plant already had very deep-cut marks, but Enkrid wasn't even going to stop and continued to deliver powerful blows. The young man wanted to master the weapons of his enemy better than he himself. The commander swung his sword and delivered a powerful slashing blow that was supposed to be the final blow. This time, Enkrid will be victorious in an imaginary duel. He was able to cut a tree trunk in half, which spoke of his incredible progress. Literally after a few hours, the young man with red hair followed his commander's order and brought him the armor that Enkrid began to put on himself. He also didn't forget the leg shields that were supposed to protect him from dangerous attacks from below and protect his legs from the inevitable collision. The ward certainly did not forget about the shield, which served as the commander's main weapon on the battlefield, being both a defense and an attack. Now the young man was fully ready for battle and could go. He understood that he could not avoid a collision again, so he prepared himself for the worst. After a few minutes, the allies began to blow their trumpets loudly, announcing the beginning of a battle with the enemy, which promised the largest scale of the entire war. The wards of the second-class detachment immediately gathered their things and prepared for battle. They took the most necessary things with them so as not to burden themselves in the duel. Jackson and Rem walked ahead of their partners, flexing their limbs. They were serious. These two have seen a lot in their lives. In front of the detachment walked the commander, who confidently looked ahead. Enkrid held a shield in his left hand and a sword in his right hand and strode forward. After some time, the detachment found itself in the ranks of a whole company, which was ready to enter the battle. Two waves from different directions clashed with each other in a duel. Enkrid immediately rushed to the battle, one of the first. Before that, he was a man with absolutely no skills and could only survive in battles thanks to three factors. His training, luck, and calmness were his main weapons. Now he had a lot more functionality that he could absolutely and completely control. The young man recalled how on the 46th day his left shoulder was broken by a mace with spikes. The next day he evaded it, but someone smashed his head from behind. After that, Enkrid practiced a lot and invented a twisting attack to decapitate his attacker in time and stay alive for the 50th day. On the 71st day, one of the soldiers cut off his leg in such a way that he could not do anything, despite the proximity of the enemy. It is because of this that today, the young man decided to put on a full set of armor. The shields on the legs fulfilled their function and protected against cuts. After a failed enemy attack, the commander of the second-rate squad delivered a powerful blow with his shield, pinning the opponent to the floor. On the 89th day, his head split open at the seams because one of the opponents threw an axe at him. Enkrid failed to notice the danger behind him in time. Now he managed to avoid this danger and understood that this man could not be left alive lest he hinder him in the final duel. There was one problem. The enemy was too far away to attack. That is why the young man decided to catch him by surprise with his throw. During dozens of days of training and fighting, the captain of the second-rate squad learned how to throw axes and hit his opponent with an accurate throw, sending him to the next world. After that, Enkrid turned his head back and saw a ward named Vel. The moment came when the ward was behind him. The commander perfectly remembered the arrow that would fly towards the man. He immediately blocked the blow of the enemy, which was called the Hawk's Claw. After that, Val was distracted by the already deflected arrow and did not notice the danger behind him. When he returned, it was already too late to act. Instead of him, the whole thing was done by Enkrid, who protected his ward at the cost of the enemy's life, cutting off his head without any pity. After that, it was time to meet the still unconquered wall. A staunch opponent, meanwhile, finished dealing with 5 opponents on the battlefield. He lifted his ominous eyes and looked in the direction of his next target. The man's gaze was completely blank and radiated only the most negative emotions. Enkrid looked straight into the eyes of his opponent without any fear. He understood that their meeting was inevitable anyway, and someone would lose in this match. The young man hoped that it would not be him. The commander of the second-rate squad stood with sword and shield in hand, waiting for the opponent. The killer was approaching his opponent with slow and confident steps with whom he had faced many times. But unlike the young man, he had no such experience. He wasn't going to stand still for long, so he immediately moved from it upon arrival and headed in the direction of the target, swinging his powerful sword. Enkrid knew perfectly well how the events on the battlefield would develop, so he had time to set up a shield. The young man did not stop being surprised at how hard the enemy was hitting. In the first encounter with the enemy, the leader of the secondary squad lost his shield. It flew into small pieces after the inevitable block. After that, Enkrid took his sword with both hands and blocked the enemy's next strike, which was as fast as possible for an ordinary soldier. The man was simply shocked when he saw how the young man used his sword to defend and attack at the same time, as if he had fought him several times. Enkrid decided to use his secret technique this time. As unexpected as possible for the opponent, he hit him with his head in the chest, throwing him back. Valen mercenary technique, which was despised by many. Enkrid picked up the ground with his foot for an even more unexpected attack. The killer could not have expected that a piece of mud would fly into his face. He met only the earth in front of him, which scattered in different directions. Blinding his opponent, Enkrid leapt high into the air and swung his sword to deliver the final blow to finish off his sworn enemy. However, the killer had a completely different opinion on this account. He quickly recovered and raised his sinister eyes, looking at his opponent with incredible fury. After that, the man immediately got up from his place and counterattacked the opponent until he had time to approach to the distance he needed. Despite his speed and surprise, Enkrid was able to avoid danger and the sword passed his throat, given his incredible experience in combat. After the attack, the killer could not keep his balance and flying forward simply fell to the ground. He could not have expected such a turn of events. Despite this, the man was by no means going to give up. He quickly rose from his seat and turned to face his opponent, preparing to start. Enkrid tried not to take his eyes off his enemy for a moment. He looked at his opponent with the same sinister and serious look in return. Thanks to his experience, the young man clearly knew what his opponent would do now. The assassin stood up and immediately struck a powerful blow with his sword in front of him. Enkrid knew absolutely everything about his opponent's crowning blow, even more. The young man moved from his seat and swung his sword for a counterattack. By calculating the exact distance to the blade of his enemy's sword, Enkrid was able to attack him so that the blades met above his head. It was at this moment that the young man made a maximum effort to strike, and the enemy could not control his weapon. The enemy's sword began to crack. Due to his incredible experience, Enkrid was able to calculate everything as accurately as possible this time, and was in a win-win situation on the battlefield. However, another one of his opponents looked at this situation differently. The archer stood on a high hill and prepared to attack his target. Literally a second later, the archer launched his arrow in the direction of the young man. The arrow flew through the entire battlefield before reaching its target. Meanwhile, the killer realized the seriousness of the situation and dropped the sword from his hands. Notes of fear appeared on his face, which, until this year, could not be seen. Enkrid understood that he would have no other way to finish this story. He gathered all his strength into a fist and swung his sword for the final blow. The commander of the second-rate squad defeated his arch-rival in an even fight. He was ready to finish an unarmed opponent at any moment. The young man had not yet guessed about the obstacle that could stand in his way. She was constantly approaching him and should have hit right in the blind spot. However, one of the wards of the young man noticed the danger that threatened the leader in time. He launched his axe in the air to repel the enemy's attack. The axe reached its target in time and stopped the arrow almost behind the young man's back. The archer missed his target and failed. Unaware of the danger behind him, Enkrid continued his duel and delivered a powerful blow directly to the opponent's throat, avenging him for himself. The man who knocked down the arrow with his axe was Rem. He was incredibly angry at the hawk's claw and was ready to tear this archer to pieces. Meanwhile, Enkrid continued his revenge and held the sword at the enemy's throat. The killer flew back a few meters after a powerful blow. He was simply shocked and could not utter a single word because his vocal cords were paralyzed and the blood loss was too great. Absolutely none of the enemies paid attention to their ally. They were occupied with something completely different, as the opponents gained more and more advantages. Enkrid also did not pay attention to any events behind his back. He was focused only on the opponent who now stood defeated in front of him. Enemy troops suffered more and more losses, which could not negatively affect their fighting spirit. The large-scale battle was moving very smoothly to its conclusion. The commander of the second-rate squad raised his gaze upwards and looked at the sky. Finally, the young man could exhale and proudly say that he had won. Now all that was left for him was to repay the man who had caused him so much suffering, for all the hundreds of attempts on this battlefield in full. The killer was on his knees helplessly, continuing to lose blood. He perfectly understood that he would soon die, but he did not stop fearing his own death. Enkrid was not going to spare his opponent and tightened his grip on his sword. He approached the enemy with as blank a face as possible. After that, the young man showed his eyes and, looking into the opponent's eyes with them, said that he was showing mercy to him, which he liked to show to everyone. Enkrid always wanted to look at the dying face of this scoundrel, but he could not resist and took his head off his shoulders before he could be scared to death. The head of the victim flew high into the air as a symbol that the young man had finally won the long-awaited victory, which spared him several more days of suffering. A sinister smile appeared on the second-rate commander's face, as if he had been dreaming about it all his life. Now at last his goal was accomplished. Enkrid broke through a wall on his way, which prevented him for several dozen days. The enemy was lying dead on the ground and bleeding. However, the young man's adventures did not end there. He suddenly felt someone's presence behind him, which resembled some huge animal. Literally in a split second, Enkrid felt excruciating pain on his left side and flew forward face first from the blow to his back. Behind him was an enemy who unexpectedly appeared on the battlefield. He really resembled an animal with long hair and paws. Holding onto his left side, Enkrid fell helplessly to the ground and screamed loudly in excruciating pain. The young man again began to lose a lot of blood. Jackson, at this moment, continued his own duel, but could not help but hear the cry of his commander and immediately turned his attention to the young man. Rem also noticed the suffering of his commander. He rushed to help the young man and noticed incredible things happening on the battlefield. Looking closely at his opponent, the big man realized that this was a very unusual enemy. His physique resembled some prehistoric man. The frog's features were clearly visible on the face. Rem almost fainted when he realized that the enemy had such incredible creatures in their ranks. Enkrid was lying on the floor and writhing in pain after a powerful blow from the frog, which was standing over him without fully lowering its foot to the ground. Suddenly, the amphibian said that she had put a lot of effort into raising her ward, but she had no idea that it would end like this. Toad did not think that her best warrior would lose his head in a fight with a second-rate commander who was not capable of anything at all. Enkrid was in a rather deplorable state to speak with the enemy. Gritting his teeth, the young man lay on the floor and simply watched the amphibian. Suddenly, the frogman took his ward's sword and swung it from behind his head, advising his targets to make one last wish. One of the squad commander's wards decided to help his leader. Using his axes, he charged into battle to stop the amphibian. This brave man turned out to be Rem. He managed to block the frog's blow at the last second and save the life of the young man on the floor. Faced with the enemy, Rem immediately began a flurry of blows with his axes to distract the toad and try to inflict damage. Amphibian Man blocked his opponent's blows with ease, substituting his sword. He did not expect that someone would stand up for this incompetent young man. It turned out that there are enough people on the battlefield. Clenching his teeth, Rem lunged towards his enemy to continue his pressure on the toad. His adversary looked a little confused, although he understood that this big man did not pose any threat to him on the battlefield. Enemies entered the duel brandishing their weapons. Rem realized already during the match how strong an opponent he met. While the two soldiers were trying to identify the stronger one of the soldiers approached the injured commander and pointed a sharp spear at him. Jackson was in time to help his leader and cut off the head of the man who wanted to take advantage of the situation and finish off the young man on the floor. Rem continued the fight, and his success left much to be desired. The man fell back a few meters after the collision with the enemy. Amphibian Man did the same. He retreated back, breaking with his paws and keeping his eyes on the enemy who was opposite. The enemies found themselves facing each other in motionless positions. Both held weapons in their hands and expected the inevitable continuation of the fight. Rem turned to his adversary and said that if he wanted to cut off the head of their commander, he would have to ask his permission first. The frogman was very surprised to hear these words. He did not expect Enkrid to be the squad leader because he was very weak. Distracting his opponent, Rem began to think about a strategy. His only option for victory was the death of the enemy from the first blow. Watching the frog, the man wondered what such a strong opponent was doing on the battlefield, which was several levels below him. There was nowhere to retreat, so Rem focused completely on himself and held the axe in front of him, preparing for possible death in seconds. The amphibious man saw the incredible mood of his opponent and took a step back, getting into a fighting stance to be able to react in time. Suddenly, both opponents stopped and calmly looked at each other. Both perfectly understood that this battle was not worth their time and lives. Based on this, the frogman turned his back on his opponent and walked confidently to the rear of his charges, who were still fighting. Rem was at first displeased and called his opponent a coward. However, somewhere in the depths of his soul, he was glad that he did not have to meet with an amphibian. Meanwhile, Jackson continued to protect the body of the wounded commander and quickly moved to be able to cut off the heads of the insidious enemy. Another soldier wanted to cut off the head of a second-rate commander. He swung his barbed staff to deal with the obstacle first. Unfortunately for him, Rem decided to rush to the battlefield. He swung his axe, and suddenly a lot of blood was spilled on the battlefield. The treacherous soldier was beheaded without even realizing it. He fully paid for his treachery and thirst for killing the wounded. Jackson saw behind him one of the enemies trying to hurt him again. The enemy went in the back and hoped to cut off his head. However, this was not destined to happen. Another member of the 4th Squad appeared on the battlefield and saved his partner Jackson in time. The enemy continued to advance. Their numbers were constantly increasing, but now there were many more allies to oppose them. The last member of the squad also rushed to the aid of his partners and began to smash his enemies, no matter what. Literally, after a few minutes, silence reigned on the battlefield. A religious man from the 4th Squad intently looked at the battlefield around. Jackson and his sleepy partner weren't going to lose their vigilance either. They carefully looked ahead, trying to assess the situation. The last member of this squad was Rem. He held an axe in his hands and stared at the danger that might threaten their leader. Ankrid, meanwhile, remained motionless, lying on the ground. He was mortally wounded and his gaze went to the ground, completely empty and hopeless. Seeing that there were many wounded and killed on the battlefield, the company commander shouted loudly, ordering his men to leave the battlefield. Ankrid heard the last order but was unable to carry it out. The young man simply closed his eyes with the hope that he would finally be able to survive this day. Fighters with alliance flags began to retreat, leaving the enemy behind. The opponents were unable to pursue them, so everything ended quite peacefully. Meanwhile, the second-rate commander found himself back in his subconscious. Looking straight ahead, he saw a drop of water falling in front of him. Enkrid lay completely helpless and stared blankly ahead. He heard a familiar voice, which again began to speak contemptuously to him. The ghost on the boat shined a lantern on the young man and told him that he would never be able to cope with the walls that would constantly appear in his path. This man in the young man's subconscious liked to talk about fate. In his opinion, it consisted in the fact that Ankrid can only give up in despair. Ankrid, after the words of the ghost, began to get up despite the pain. He was not going to listen to his words because he knew his way very well. Behind the young man was a wall that was already half broken. This indicated that Ankrid was on the right track. Having risen to his full height, Ankrid had to agree that the walls in his path really constantly appear, and it turns out to be very difficult to break them. The young man looked confidently at the ghost and added that the walls in his life appear in order for him to break through them and move into the future. The ghost smiled and replied that it would wait until the eyes, filled with lust and ambition, would eventually fade and lose their luster. Literally, after a few seconds, Ankrid opened his eyes and found himself lying on the bed. His body was bandaged, considering the wounds received in battle. The young man looked up and saw above him a huge tent, which spoke of a tent in which several standard lanterns were burning from above. Ankrid immediately realized that he was in the first aid station. Suddenly, the young man heard a familiar voice on his left, who shouted with joy. Glancing to the left, the commander saw his ward Rem, who greeted the leader and informed him that he had slept for 2 whole days. Rem asked the young man if he remembered that the big man on the battlefield saved him from the toad. Ankrid asked what he was talking about. Suddenly, the young man felt an unbearable pain in his chest and remembered the frog on the battlefield that had hit him. It was a miracle that he survived. Rem reported that the commander's bones were not broken, but he was very shaken. Zadrovan asked if the young man remembered his best friend Rem. Ankrid closed his eyes and answered the interlocutor that they were never friends. In general, for the first time on the battlefield, they were able to understand each other and help each other. Immediately after these words, Rem jumped up from his seat and covered the squad commander's mouth. Ankrid did not understand what was happening at all. Casting his gaze in different directions, the young man realized that he was not the only one in the ward. 6 beds were here, although not all were filled. Encrid took the hand of the interlocutor from his mouth and asked him why he did such things, because he always did not care about such statements. The commander of the second-rate squad still survived the second day. He woke up in the back of his company, where he could be properly cared for. After Rem, another ward named Chris came to him. The young man demanded that the commander give him back the money he had spent on armor. Encrid looked at his interlocutor and did not understand why such an ordinary soldier like him got to the main medical center and not to an ordinary ward. In response, the young man asked his ward where he was during the fight, because his soul, as usual, was not visible on the battlefield. Christ smiled and said that he would make the commander a special discount just for him. The young man simply asked to pay him double the amount. Encrid was forced to lie in bed all day. The sun was already slowly setting below the horizon and the young man was still in the main medical center. Another ward decided to visit him in the evening. Jackson slowly and confidently entered the ward of the medical center and surveyed the area around him. Encrid was very surprised that Jackson decided to visit him. The young man immediately asked the man why he came here, because this is not in his repertoire at all. Without answering anything verbally, the man took out a small metal box from his pocket and threw it on the bed where the young man was lying. After that, Jackson left the ward and told the commander that this is a gel that should be applied to the body twice a day. The man asked not to ask any more questions. Opening the tank, Encrid saw with his own eyes the gel that Jackson always used on himself. The young man did not understand what happened to the man, that he suddenly started sharing his own things. Literally a few minutes later, another visitor, Ward Auden, came to him. He sat next to the young man and prayed to God, lamenting his health. Encrid stared at the ceiling and tried to understand why this was necessary at all. He did not really like the prayers that the ward had been reading for several minutes. At some point, the captain interrupted the prayer of his ward and in a stern voice asked him to leave the ward because he was not yet dead. Auden left his commander and he was finally able to be alone. Deep night came and the members of the detachment went to sleep in their quarters. Encrid looked into the steel and tried to understand why the wards were worried about him, because before they were always busy with their own affairs. The young man closed his eyes and thought that they suddenly began to care about him, although it was a hasty conclusion to say something for sure. Suddenly another visitor entered the ward with an apple in his hands. He opened the main ward of the infirmary to visit the wounded captain. A young man who always liked to sleep in the morning, on the contrary, walked the streets at night. Encrid was very surprised when someone entered his room. Ward of a young man named Ranga looked at his commander with a surprised look and asked him why he was in the main infirmary at all. After standing in place for a few seconds, Ranga put the apple in his teeth and, turning his back to the commander, left the main ward of the medical center. Encrid was calm, at least for one of his wards, who had not changed at all, because Rangi always didn't care what happened around him. The morning of the next day came very quickly, and all the patients in the ward woke up. In addition to the commander of the second-rate squad, there were 2 more people here. One of them was a platoon commander from the 2nd Company who fought side by side with Encrid. He really didn't like being constantly looked at in the ward. The other man was a soldier whose name was unknown to Encrid. He constantly spent time alone and stared into the void in front of him. According to the young man, this man resembled a soldier who had a very low rank. They both seemed very strange guests in the ward of the main medical center. Suddenly, Encrid became aware of very strange noises from the morning. The entrance to the chamber suddenly opened, which means that he had another visitor. Other patients in the main ward of the medical center also drew attention to the central entrance. They were eagerly waiting to see who they would see right in front of them. Encrid was very surprised when he saw a female figure in front of him in the chamber. He didn't understand what a woman was doing in the men's ward. The young man immediately drew attention to her strange ears, which were somewhat elongated and different from the usual ones. They resembled the ears of an elf. The woman had a not very thick leather belt, which was obviously given to her as a trophy. She also carried a sword with her, which spoke of her military career. A woman with a helmet in her hands and the image of an elf entered the ward as confidently as possible. She immediately looked around and saw 3 men in front of her. After that, without looking at any of the patients, she asked which of those present was the commander of the 444th Squad. Encrid was very surprised to hear such a question. He was the commander of the 4th Company, the 4th Platoon, the 4th Squad, about which the woman asked. None of those present in the chamber answered the woman's question. The men just looked at her in silence, understanding that she had forgotten here. The platoon commander looked at their guest with a surprised look and asked if a fairy had visited them, demonstratively showing his surprise. The woman immediately asked the man what group he was from. He became famous as Vengeance, the commander of the 3rd platoon of the 2nd Company. After that, the fairy asked the interlocutor whether in their mouth they are taught to immediately speak the race of a person who is older than him in rank. Vengeance immediately realized his mistake and lowered his head. He apologized to the woman and promised that this would not happen again. Encred also put everything in its place. He realized that this fairy was the new commander of the 4th Company that had replaced the deceased. After realizing this, the young man immediately decided to introduce himself, because he was the commander of the 444th Detachment, which the woman asked about immediately. The fairy expressed gratitude to the young man for the fact that he works well with difficult members of the squad. The woman said that she hopes for their fruitful cooperation. Encred did not answer and silently looked after his commander. He couldn't understand if the fairy had come here just to say that. The woman kept leaving the main ward of the medical center until she suddenly stopped. She remembered another person present lying on the bed opposite. Turning her head to the stranger, the fairy asked him what his name was. The young man was a little confused in this situation and remained silent for a few seconds. After that, he spoke the name Krang very uncertainly, as if he had never used his real name and had no desire to talk about it. Encred, observing the young man, concluded that he may be a nobleman. His behavior in front of the company commander was simply unacceptable. The fairy looked at her ward with arrogance in her eyes. Judging by the expression on her face, she did not really like the attitude of her ward towards her. Despite this, the woman decided not to do anything. She simply turned and walked towards the exit again, leaving the men alone in the ward. Encred could understand absolutely nothing. He silently looked in the direction of the company commander, who at first glance behaved very strangely. The men woke up very early today. The sun was just beginning to rise from behind the mountains, and the patients in the ward had already met the morning without light. Encred woke up and raised his right hand up. He gripped her tightly in his fist, feeling his strength return to him after his rest. After that, the young man clenched his fist and straightened his arms up. Encred tried to feel every muscle and the pain that prevents movement. Through an experimental method, the commander of the second-rate squad realized that most of the pain had almost disappeared, so he could start training. Vengeance was very surprised and asked his roommate where he was going. Putting on his shoes, the young man replied that he was heading to the training area. The platoon commander lay down on the bed and called the interlocutor an idiot. In his opinion, low-ranking soldiers should not behave so arrogantly. Meanwhile, the young man with the fictitious name Krang said absolutely nothing and silently looked at the young man who confidently left the room with a sword in his hands. Encred completely ignored the words of his interlocutor, who called him an idiot. He went to the training area and was going to reminisce a little. The young man repeatedly experienced the last battle. He mentioned one of the most useful techniques that he spent a lot of money to learn. This method was a blow at the very last moment. Now the squad commander realized that this method cannot be relied on because it is too dangerous. Encred understood that he could simply not hit the enemy and then he would say goodbye to life. In his opinion, investing in one shot is not the best idea. The young man remembered his protege Rem, whose axe blows were fatal, so this method was much more suitable for him than for his sword. Suddenly, the second-rate commander was forced to interrupt his thoughts and training when he heard a familiar voice behind him, praising him for his dedication to the cause. Turning his head to the right, Encred saw Krang in front of him. The young man came to the training area and asked why Encred was training so hard. The commander informed the interlocutor that he had been training his capture power in the ward and was now trying to recreate his most recent battle. Krang was even more surprised and asked why the young man would do such things. Encred confidently replied that he simply did not want to screw up again. Krang still did not fully understand his interlocutor and asked why he paid so much attention to the cost of a mistake. Did he want to save his life at any cost? Encred looked surprised at the young man, who had read his thoughts almost right through. He looked at him coldly for several seconds without answering anything. The young man raised his head and looked at the sky, remembering his dream, which most people just scoff at, so he did not want to tell about it. Encred gripped the sword tightly in both hands and thought that maybe he would never achieve his dream and all the people around him would turn out to be absolutely right. Raising the blade of the sword to the sky, the young man caught the glare of the sun and realized that in any case, he would go through the journey, and it didn't matter how it ended. Holding the sword in front of him, Encred decided to answer the interlocutor's question after all, and said that in the future, he wanted to become a knight. Krang was speechless for a few seconds after the young man's answer. He opened his mouth wide and began to change his position, slowly rising to his feet. Encred looked at the young man with a cold and restrained look and waited for him to laugh and trample on his dream, as most people did. Without waiting for absolutely nothing, Ankrid told the interlocutor that for the first time he saw a person who did not laugh at his dream. Krang started to get up from his seat and said he just forgot something. He suddenly remembered it and decided to do it right away. Heading towards the forest, Krang said goodbye to the commander and thanked him for reminding him of the important things he needed to do. Ankrid remained standing where he was, sword in hand. He did not understand absolutely anything because the interlocutor did not explain the meaning of his affairs. After all, the second-rate commander could thank the interlocutor for not laughing at him, but on the contrary, inspired by his own idea. Suddenly, Krang stopped in his place and turned his head towards the commander. He asked the young man to remember his name if he ever became a knight. Ankrid received support at the expense of his dream. After training, he returned to the infirmary again, where breakfast was supposed to be waiting for him. Soldiers sat near the main chamber, humming a song to an incomprehensible musical instrument. They shouted loudly about the hero of the battle named Cypress. Vengeance did not like such songs very much. The man wanted to get breakfast, but instead the soldiers fed him only with their worthless songs. Before breakfast, Ankrid went for a short walk and met Jackson on his way, who asked the commander about his well-being. Ankrid replied that he was recovering very quickly thanks to the gel his ward had given him. The young man was very grateful to the man for his cream. Jackson exhaled slowly and said that if the commander is really grateful to him, then he should recover very quickly and return to his unit. Ankrid didn't spend a long day doing absolutely nothing. The young man did not have time to notice how night came and he had to go to bed already. Krang was sleeping in the bed opposite, and before going to sleep, he wished his new companion good night. The young man made the impression of a very positive friend. Ankrid mutually wished his friend good night and went to bed. The second-rate commander covered himself with a sheet from above and took his time extinguishing the candle. Wegsons expressed his dissatisfaction with the fact that his roommates are still talking, although they should have been asleep for 10 years. Ankrid had done absolutely nothing useful all day, apart from going to bed early. The young man closed his eyes and had hope for the next busy day. Waking up the next morning, the squad captain again heard outside the ward some men singing the praises of the hero Cypress. The young man found it very strange that Vengeance was asking for breakfast again. The man looked very angry and generally behaved with contempt towards those around him. Suddenly, Ankrid opened his eyes wide and began to breathe more deeply. He realized that such things do not happen by chance, and perhaps he once again fell into a vicious circle. Drops of sweat appeared on his face. The young man became very worried and got up from his bed to check everything. This morning, he did not have time to practice and went for a walk where he met Jackson. The man again asked the commander about his well-being. Already at this moment, the commander realized that he had fallen into a trap. In a sad voice, he replied to his ward that he was very grateful to him for the medicine. Jackson, as he did yesterday morning, repeated that the commander should soon recover and return to the ranks in order to fully thank him. At this answer, Ankrid almost lost his eyes from their sockets. Now he was convinced that yesterday was repeating itself again today. The young man remembered the words of the ghost in his subconscious, who spoke of another wall that he would not be able to overcome and would eventually give up in the face of difficulties. Ankrid could not understand how he could have died in the first place. The only option left was death while he slept soundly in the main ward of the infirmary. The young man seemed to be standing in front of a huge wall. He felt as stupid as possible because he could not even feel his own death. Despite this, the commander was not going to give up. On the contrary, the incomprehensible problem made him much more determined and gave him an impetus for action. It was another test that the young man had to pass without thinking. The day passed very quickly, and a bright starry night came in the yard. Ankrid again did absolutely nothing all day, and in the evening lit a candle next to his bed. Everything was repeated exactly as it was yesterday. After wishing good night to his friend, the young man turned to his side and began to think who could have killed him, because the enemies hardly know about the location of this medical center. After a few minutes, the second-rate commander came to the conclusion that the killer was most likely among the allies and would arrive here very soon. Ankrid had only one person in his mind who could be the killer. The fairy knew the location of the central infirmary and could have high killing skills. At the realization that the commander of the fourth company could be an enemy, Ankrid opened his eyes wide and did not understand how this could happen. The young man was forced to admit that the fairy's quiet and nimble feet were the most ideal for killing, especially in the dark of the day. Ankrid understood that the reason why the fairy came to their chamber in the morning was to determine the exact location of her future victims. The young man looked at the only entrance to the medical center and gathered his strength. He understood that he just needed to scream loudly when he saw the killer with his own eyes. Encred gathered his strength and simply pressed himself against his bed, waiting for the killer. He had absolutely nothing to do but wait. A few minutes passed, and the young man simply could not believe his feelings. An arrow landed in his neck, and it was unclear where it came from. Casting his gaze to the left, the commander realized that there was now a poisonous needle in his neck, which did not give him any chance to scream. Encred began to writhe in excruciating pain, clutching his neck. He didn't even have time to notice how the killer entered, and he was already saying goodbye to his life. The young man could not move of his own will or even speak. He fell helplessly to the floor, trying to get up from the bed. Now he understood why he died without even knowing about his death. The paralyzing poison penetrated deep into his body and took effect instantly. Looking at the platoon leader Vengas, Encred saw that the man had met the same fate as him. He lay motionless on his bed. There was one more wounded person in the ward. The second-rate commander looked in the direction of his friend's bed and saw a man hiding his face behind a hood. Encred realized that Krang was still alive and tried to shout loudly to wake him up, but all efforts proved futile. The assassin slowly took the sword out of its scabbard and held it out in front of him, preparing for the fatal blow that would end the matter in the main ward of the infirmary. Krang managed to wake up for a few seconds and immediately saw a sword in front of him. His blade penetrated deep into his body and took his life. With incomprehension and horror on his face, the young man left this world. He absolutely did not understand what his empty gaze directed at the ceiling was talking about. Encred tried his best to fight for his life and the life of his friend. Clenching his teeth, the young man continued to move forward, crawling along the floor. Suddenly, with his own eyes, the second-rate commander had the opportunity to observe how the main ward of the medical center was cut by a sword blade from the backside. Another person in a red robe with a hood entered the ward. Encred was very much surprised that the killer turned out to be the work of more than one person. Encred felt his consciousness leaving his body, but he tried to hold on. He wanted to find out who the killer really was at any cost. The young man tried to take a closer look at the guest's hood and was finally able to notice an important detail. It was an elf-ear that was very familiar. Encred lowered his gaze and met again the familiar object in the form of a sword and leather belt that he had seen yesterday and this morning. Now all the puzzles came together, and the second-rate commander could clearly conclude that his previous guesses turned out to be absolutely correct. The commander of the 4th Company turned out to be a traitor. The fairy broke into the main ward of the medical center, and with the help of an accomplice, killed 3 patients. Having once again said goodbye to his life, Encred woke up the next morning completely safe and sound, which provided him with a blue artifact. The young man again heard men singing about the hero of the battle under the main ward of the medical center. The singers played hard on the small harp, but did not sing very well. Encred heard this song for the 3rd morning in a row. Everything was absolutely identical, and the young man could not understand how he should act in that situation. He didn't even close his eyes for 2 nights in a row, but he still couldn't see the enemies who suddenly broke into the ward of the medical center. In addition, the thought of the company commander, who was an unusual opponent, did not occur to the young man. He understood that a confrontation with her would bring a lot of problems. Encred sat on his bed and stared at the ground. He felt completely helpless when his skills in the situation were completely powerless. More than anything in the world, the young man did not like this very feeling. It appeared to him very recently when he was going through trials for several days in a row. The image of the fiercest enemy he had to fight never disappeared from his imagination. This strong and treacherous warrior was deeply etched in memory. Despite his strength, Encred still defeated him and perfectly remembered the moment when he cut off his head absolutely without pity. The head flew high into the air and symbolized the indisputable victory of the commander. Therefore, Encred did not completely give up in this situation. He got up from his seat and, looking up, promised himself that he would definitely find a way to win despite all the obstacles. Having woken up and dressed, Encred immediately rushed to the bed of one of the sick and lifted the sheet, checking for enemies. Vengens was simply shocked to see the young man in front of him. He was very angry with him because this was simply unacceptable behavior. Encred made sure that the killer was not in the medical center at that moment and decided to check from the outside. Vengeance, meanwhile, continued to voice his displeasure. Having calmed down, the man smiled mischievously and called the young man a real idiot who was suited to the job of searching for cockroaches in the wards of the medical center. Encred thanked the man for caring about his fate. Vengens did not like this answer very much and explained to the young man that it was sarcasm. After all, Encred also spoke with notes of sarcasm. Vengeance became very angry and shouted at the young man, ordering him to get out of here. At that moment, a third patient entered the ward. Krang heard the loud shouts of his roommates and asked me why they were fighting again. The young man did not really want to enter the ward, as he did not tolerate conflicts. He asked the neighbors maybe he should come a little later. Encred explained that their conflict was over and the young man could enter. Vengeance did not think so at all and fell helplessly on the bed, cursing the young man. Krang slowly made his way to his bed and began to make the bed. Encred watched his companion intently and thought that he was the cause of their joint death. The captain made these conclusions based on the fact that the killers finished him off in the very last turn. Also, Krang was constantly behaving very strangely. Encred knew perfectly well that he needed to learn as much as possible about this new companion, but he did not want to resort to the methods of his friends. The captain of the second-rate squad did not want to insist that the man tell everything about himself, despite the possible traumas of the past. But still, the young man understood that it must be done, since Krang is most likely the main reason for the murder and drags everyone down. Suddenly, Encred turned to his companion, and he immediately left his work when he heard an incomprehensible question addressed to him. The second-rate squad captain asked who Krang really was. The young man's expression immediately changed. He began to sweat and worry about the situation. Encred, seeing the interlocutor's reaction, immediately realized that he does not know how to communicate with people, just like his ward Rem. Krang did not back down from the question and decided to think a little about the question, periodically repeating the phrase, "Who am I?" Encred and Vengeance stared intently at their roommate, waiting for an answer. Krang finally replied that he could not tell everything. Encred continued to press his point and asked what was the matter then. Krang let out a slow breath and said it was a very long story. The commander of the 444th Detachment really wanted to know the truth, but he understood that most likely the young man would not want to tell why he ended up in this ward. Encred decided to withdraw from this dialogue and said that he understood his interlocutor. Vengeance at this point was simply shocked by this turn of events. The man got angry and asked the young man why he started this dialogue in the first place, if he backed away so easily from information that he never managed to find out. Vengeance decided to join this mini-investigation and concluded that Krang belongs to a completely different country and may be a spy. When the young man heard an inappropriate question in his direction, he looked at the interlocutor with a cold look, as if warning him to keep his mouth shut. Vengeance immediately caught the look and nearly pissed his pants. The platoon commander was as brave as he constantly positioned himself. Krang moved from his seat and walked confidently and slowly towards the man who had just asked him the question. Vengeance rose from his bed, holding the sheet in his hands. The man slowly worried about what the drops of sweat on his face were saying. Krang looked the platoon leader straight in the eyes and confidently said that he had never betrayed and was not going to betray a kind of kingdom. Encred stood aside and watched the young man's reaction. He could conclude that the stranger really wasn't lying given his behavior. According to his manners, movements, and general aura, Krang very much reminded the commander of the 444th unit of a knight who works as if undercover. Vengeance was indignant that the young man was talking to his superiors. Krang smiled and called the man Sir, after which he laughed loudly. Encred backed away from his idea that Krang could be a knight, as he remembered that he had been unable to do absolutely anything during the night he died. However, the young man knew very well that this stranger was hiding some information about himself, so it is necessary to find out in order to get the key to the solution. The day again passed exactly the same for Encred. He lit a candle by his bedside before meeting death again in the night. The not-so-old friends wished each other a good night, but this time Vengeance didn't say anything, but still coughed calmly. Encred immediately noticed that the man was not eloquent today. The young man wondered if the platoon commander was so afraid of Krenga today. The young man turned to the right side and cast his gaze in the direction of the exit, from where, according to his observations, the thieves definitely could not get out. For a while he looked at the dark sky and thought that the thieves would arrive here any minute, so something had to be changed that night. Encred rose from his bed and did not forget to take his sword with him. Vengeance was still awake at that moment and was very surprised to see the young man. The man asked the second-in-command if he was healthy enough to train instead of rehabilitating his weak body. Encred cast his cold gaze on the interlocutor and warned that soon assassins would break into their chamber and offered the man to cooperate in order to survive. Vengeance was simply shocked by such an offer. He didn't understand what a crazy young man who had absolutely no understanding of wars wanted from him. Of course, the platoon commander did not believe his interlocutor and simply turned on his side, calling him an idiot who trusts only his stupid intuition. Krang also took his time to trust his new friend and just lay face up, smiling. The stranger did not foresee absolutely any danger. Encred looked at the young man hopefully for some time, waiting for an answer from him, but he did not receive one, and he was not very surprised at this. Suddenly, the young man suddenly heard the killer's voice behind him. His pupils dilated widely. The killers realized that he had thought about an ambush. Immediately after the voice, Encred saw directly in front of him his own blood, which was left behind after being stabbed in the neck with a poisoned needle. The young man could not spare a second to concentrate on this. The tent behind him tore, and the needle immediately landed on his body. Encred just reached for his sword, but it was too late. He had already begun to lose blood, and his body weakened, unable to continue the fight. Vengeance paid for his imprudence, and was also hit with a poisonous needle. Now the man realized that he had better listen to the crazy young man. Krang was the last to be killed. The killer this time acted much faster and landed with the sword on the young man's chest. Encred had some hope for the stranger, but lost it in a second. The commander fell helplessly to the floor, continuing to lose blood. He woke up again that morning and heard loud chanting. Encred did not receive support from his neighbors, and again paid with his life. The young man decided to ask for support from the main command, but received a clear and understandable answer, which sent him as far as possible. Encred had no choice but to act on his own, and wanted to anticipate the actions of the enemy and shout at the moment when they were as close as possible to the ward. Watching the main entrance to the ward of the medical center, the young man held onto his sword and chose the right moment to give a signal to all sleeping allies. Encred had no way of knowing when the enemy would begin to act. He did not have an accurate watch, so he could not clearly choose the right moment. When the young man heard the faintest sound in his presence, he immediately tried to shout loudly, but everything turned out to be in vain. The needle had already overtaken him. Encred did not realize this yet and tried to scream, but nothing came out. Blood began to spurt from his throat, taking his life. The young man realized that he had absolutely failed again, as the enemy was too fast to overtake him even for a fraction of a second. The next day, Encred again decided to go it alone, and wanted to catch the enemy by surprise before they began to act in earnest. The young man went around the tent from different sides, but could not notice anything at all. Meanwhile, the enemy was already in an ambush and prepared for a surprise attack. Before the commander even had time to think, the needle had already landed in his throat. Encred always wondered how he could defeat an enemy he could not even see. While the young man saw only one picture in front of him, the enemy was hiding behind him and could predict his every move in the next seconds. Poisonous needles repeatedly entered the throat of the commander, who could not do anything about it. Each of his attempts ended in inevitable death. Encred understood one thing: if he could not avoid the poisonous needles, then he would die every time without the possibility of making even a bold step. Several attempts in a row turned out to be completely useless. The young man woke up again in the main ward of the medical center after hearing songs about the hero of the battle. He immediately got out of bed and grabbed the hilt of his sword, facing his 20th morning, the details of which he remembered as best he could. The thought of these 20 days was simply murderous for the commander, because he could not even get close to the enemy who was hiding in the dark. His face was as gloomy and blank as possible considering the circumstances. He had absolutely no success and no idea what to do next. Despite this, Encred did not get upset and did not give up. A pleasant smile appeared on his face as he looked at the situation from the other side. Encred lived only 20 days, which is a very small number compared to what he lived during his past adventure. The young man understood that first he needed to invent a way to avoid the poisonous wires and then deal with the killers directly. Encred was looking for the fastest way to avoid the enemy's gaze and met Jackson on his way, sitting on a box near the ward. The 444th Squad commander's gaze immediately settled on the man who was sharpening his weapon and was completely focused on the process. Encred recalled that he once had a conversation with a friend who told him very interesting things about Jackson and his shooting spree. While sparring with Rem, Encred asked his partner why Jackson was called a perverted wildcat. Rem was just shocked at the question. Ann Creed heard Jackson's teammates call him that more than once. Rem replied that the nickname stuck to him because of his incredibly dirty fighting style. Rem said that Jackson never fights the enemy face to face. His enemy does not even have time to understand that he entered the battle with a man. Jackson always went into the back of his enemy and delivered a blow from which it is impossible to get up. A few seconds were enough for the man to win. Jackson was distracted from his work when he saw the commander in his path. He did not understand why the young man was looking so intently straight into his face. Jackson asked the captain if his wounds had healed yet. At that moment, Encred thought that Jackson would be able to defeat the night killers. However, there was one problem. Encred could not take the ward with him because he lacked the authority, so it was necessary to do something different. In addition, the commander of the second-rate squad wanted to climb his wall alone and deal with the assassins, who had now become his main targets. Encred just stood motionless for a while, looking down. He invented a plan by which he needed to become better than Jackson. The captain asked the protege to imagine a situation where someone like him gets in the opponent's back with his sneakiest shot. Encred wanted to know from Jackson what a person should do in such a situation. The man thought about the question and sat in silence for a while. Literally, after a few seconds, Jackson gave a clear and comprehensive answer. No one survived his attack, so there is simply no point in talking about it. Encred was very surprised when he heard this answer. He realized that his fate would remain inevitable until he could become more skilled than the enemy. Having received a not very positive answer from his ward, Encred lowered his gaze to the ground and hopelessly froze in one place. Jackson looked at the commander of his squad and could not understand what he wanted from him. This question seemed very strange to him. Seeing that the young man wasn't going to just leave, Jackson let out a breath and realized that he was still waiting for an explanation on how to avoid death. Rising a little from his seat, the man pointed his hand behind his back and explained that only the eyes behind him could save him from an unexpected attack. Encred looked at his ward with a surprised face. He didn't understand what that even meant, because it was literally impossible. While the friends were having a dialogue with each other, completely ordinary things were happening in their camp. Each soldier did some work. Hearing a sound somewhere in space, Jackson asked his captain if he could see a cart in front of him now. Encred was a little confused in this situation. He began to look around, but without success. Seeing this, Jackson told the captain that he needed to look as far behind the tents as possible. Encred was very surprised when he saw the cart, because it was very far away. The young man wondered if Jackson really had eyes in the back of his head. The man sat with his eyes closed and did not turn his head back at all. Literally after a few seconds, he assumed that the cart was going to break down. Not even 10 seconds passed before the man's prophecy came true. The person who was pulling the cart was now forced to repair it because of his imprudence. Jackson at this moment continued to sit motionless. His face was completely cold and did not show even the slightest emotion. This could not be said about his interlocutor. Encred was simply shocked and looked with admiration at the cart, which really fell apart before his eyes. The captain turned to his ward and asked if he could predict the future. Jackson smiled and said that the hospital was having a very bad effect on the commander. Encred asked not to mock him and to explain everything normally. Jackson put his finger to his ear and said that he was able to know the future through sound. The man explained that he could hear the cart moving, then listened that the axle holding everything on it was not very well secured. Jackson added that he can literally predict the future if he hears what is happening around him within earshot. Encred was simply shocked how his friend could hear such a soft sound. The young man himself did not even hear the moment when the cart ended up in their camp. Getting up from his seat, Jackson suggested that the commander practice and listen to everything around him, isolating and dividing the sounds into groups. Encred was even surprised at how accurately the man explained everything. He asked why Jackson didn't want to explain properly to him earlier then. The man turned his face back and replied that Encred had not clung to him before, and now he would not let go until he got the answer to his question. Jackson added that lately it seems to him that the commander will stop at absolutely nothing. Encred perfectly understood that he had changed. During almost the whole day, the young man tried to listen and distribute the sounds. The day flew by as quickly as possible, and the night of tragedy came again on the street. Encred lay motionless on his bed, eyes closed. He listened to every sound and thought of only one person in his wild imagination. The young man stood in front of a high wall in the form of an assassin who posed an incredible threat not only to him, but also to all his allies. The fateful needle that was constantly stuck in his throat was called Death Without a Face by the commander of the second-rate squad. Dispelling all his thoughts, Encred concentrated on the sounds, because he understood that he would survive only if he could feel the moment of faceless death. He listened in more and more detail to each sound, using the technique of Jackson, who always knew what he was talking about. Listening carefully, Encred felt someone's footsteps outside the tent. He immediately understood that they were ordinary patrolmen, since he had time to learn their steps in a day. After that, he heard the sounds of fire and the crackling of torches, which spoke of the lighting used in the camp, even during the nighttime. Meanwhile, a fateful killer in a raincoat has already appeared near the tent. He managed to avoid extra eyes and remain completely unnoticed. Despite today's training, the commander still did not manage to sense the killer. He tried his best, but little depended on him. The killer landed as quietly as possible on the ground. The young man had no chance to hear him because he had not trained enough to hear a professional. Enkrid already had a sense of time when the assassin arrived in the ward. He understood that it would happen in the next few seconds, but he could not listen to the environment. Meanwhile, the killer, without lingering in one place for a long time, suddenly rose into the air and left behind only dust, absolutely no unnecessary traces. As soon as this happened, the poisonous needle was already in the young man's throat. Enkrid could not do anything, and only hoarse from the pain in his throat. The young man could not understand how this was even possible. The enemy turned out to be much more nimble and quieter than he could have imagined in any of his dreams. The next morning, Enkrid woke up completely in a bad mood. It was obvious that he was completely defeated, meeting his death once again. The young man did not manage to advance a single step, but he noticed some successes. His body remembered everything clearly, so it was necessary to continue filling his experience. After leaving the medical ward, Enkrid decided to immediately go to his ward so that he could tell him even more useful information about his technique. Jackson said that he can, depending on quiet and loud sounds, find out how far away the target is and distinguish barely audible distant sounds. Enkrid listened attentively to how the man managed to achieve such skill. He wanted at any cost to get an extra pair of eyes behind his back. Suddenly, Jackson interrupted his speech with a snap of his fingers. It was a very loud sound that shocked the second-rate squad captain. After the sound, Jackson explained that the sound is a wave that can be felt even a kilometer away, despite all the obstacles that stand in the way. Clenching his fist, the man added that it is very important to learn to single out one single wave among thousands that you can only meet on your way. After listening to the lecture of his ward, the commander went to practice. There were a lot of sounds in the camp which actually mixed with each other. Enkrid sat down on the green grass and took a deep breath. He needed to hear each sound, then distinguish it and submit it to a certain category. The young man immediately clearly heard the fluttering of flags. His skill was far from counting the number of these flags, but it was already some progress. After that, Enkrid was able to understand with which foot the soldiers stepped on the ground. He also roughly understood that a detachment of 10 men was marching now. In a few minutes, the young man really achieved certain results. Most of the sounds were familiar to him, and he could easily give them a certain category. However, there were sounds that did not obey the categories at all. The young man heard a strange sound and did not understand that it was a bird that flew in and sat on the flag. Suddenly, Enkrid was forced to interrupt his practice when he heard an old acquaintance approach him who called him Enki. Krang turned out to be this acquaintance. A young man came with a bag on his shoulders and asked his new friend what his new training was. Enkrid was in no hurry to answer the question, and looking at the interlocutor with a serious look, asked what the name Enki meant. Krang decided to give his friend an abbreviated name, although they had known each other for about a day. Enkrid didn't like it very much, but he was ready to accept it. Enki replied to a friend's question that he was just sitting in one place and breathing air, asking if it was like some kind of training. Krang agreed that it didn't feel like training, but he remembered very well that the young man would not use the time so unwisely. Enkrid was pleasantly surprised at how well the young man got to know him during that day. He really didn't waste his time preparing for tonight. The day again imperceptibly passed, and the same second came when the needle flew in the direction of the young man, who was lying on the bed and attentively listening to every sound. Despite his slightly greater experience, Enkrid was once again unable to hear a single sound. His body was paralyzed as the needle landed in his throat. The whole face of the young man was sweaty. He cast his gaze to the left where his comrade was stationed. Enkrid wanted to notice at least some details. The young man could not see anything except the terrible death of his friend. The killer raised his sword up and thrust it into the victim's stomach with all his might. Enkrid tried to look closely at the killer's face, but he saw only a bloody sword and a completely opaque hood in front of him. Krang's scream every time scared the half-alive Enkrid, who writhed from the pain caused by the poison from the inside. Enkrid lived the same day 33 times but did not achieve any success. It was incredibly difficult for him to realize the fact of his hopelessness. For the 34th time, he again failed to sense the main enemy approaching the ward. It seemed to merge with nature, becoming one whole. The man landed in such a way that even a predator could hardly hear him. Enkrid again did not hear the main enemy, who was a few steps ahead. Again, all 3 patients in the ward turned out to be dead. Krang lay with his sword in his chest, which meant another night of absolute failure. Despite the defeats, Enkrid woke up every morning and went to train. He sat in the lotus position on the training ground and listened to every sound. The young man admitted that this test is much more difficult than the previous one, because little depends on his experience. considering the incredible speed of the enemy. Also, no skills other than hearing could help him. The enemy was so fast and invisible that perhaps Jackson would not even hear him. Ankrit understood that he just needed to relive the same moment over and over again, and sooner or later he would be able to look his death in the face. This time, the young man was able to hear a familiar sound and understand that the bird had landed on the flag. Every day he took small steps towards success. Ankrit was able to listen to this sound so much that he realized that the bird was sitting on one leg, and its weight was affecting the movement of the flag in the air. The image of the killer landing near the tent could not be removed from the young man's imagination. Weed believed that sooner or later he would be able to hear his insidious tracks. Suddenly, Ankrit heard the already familiar sounds and opened his eyes to meet the familiar that passed by him every time. On this day, Krang also stopped by his roommate with a sack on his back. He looked and tried to understand why the young man was sitting here. Krang asked his neighbor's acquaintance if he had heard him sneak up on him and only then opened his eyes. Krang had many questions for his friend. He asked how long he had been sitting here with his eyes closed and did he really want to train his attentiveness. Every day the young man repeated the same phrase, "And Ankrit is definitely not a fool and will not waste his time on incomprehensible things." At last the fateful night came again, and the murderer stealthily approached the ward with the sick to finish off the men inside. He again threw the needle in the direction of the young man, but this time it was unsuccessful. Ankrit was finally able to sense the presence of his opponent and avoided death at the last moment. The young man had previously hidden his weapon under his pillow and now reached for his sword to engage in equal combat with his opponent. The assassin was simply shocked when he realized that he had failed to deal with his target, who now threatens to derail an incredible secret mission. Ankrit struck the nose with a powerful blow with his sword, and the killer was forced to retreat. He jumped several meters back and landed hard on his back on the floor. The man was scared to death and surprised by the young man's skills. He was visibly sweating as he understood that he was in the most disadvantageous position. Instead, Ankrit grinned sinisterly into his opponent's face and could now finally clearly see that he was Death with a very real face. The killer was not happy about what was happening. He did not understand how the young man was able to track him down and repel the unexpected attack. The man immediately moved from his place and delivered a powerful blow with the sword he took from behind his back. He did not want to leave any witnesses. Ankrit knew he was in danger when the blade of the sword came within an inch of his throat. Fortunately, the young man managed to avoid danger. The commander of the 444th Detachment looked at the killer carefully and realized that he did not feel as confident in a duel as in silent murders. Ankrit managed to survive after the poisonous needles were thrown at him, but he suddenly remembered his neighbors and glanced to the left. Vergen's on the bed. The young man immediately noticed a poisonous needle in his neck and realized that the man was dead. However, Krang was safe for now. He was awakened by the sudden noises and immediately reached for his weapon to engage in a duel. Suddenly, Ankrit remembered his main rival. The killer was right in front of his face and was about to send the young man to the next world. Thanks to his training and experience, Ankrit was able to avoid mortal danger. The assassin was much slower than his fierce opponent in the last fight. The man's face showed that he was very panicked. He decided not to play anymore and threw one of his knives into the enemy's face. Ankrit did not expect such a turn of events and barely managed to take a step back. Despite this, he did not manage to avoid a collision with a knife. A cut appeared on the young man's chest which made him lose his balance. Ankrit took a few steps back and hoped that the knife was not poisoned. Meanwhile, another important figure appeared on the battlefield. She swung her sword to tip the battlefield in her favor. Ankrit immediately heard something terrible approaching him. Continuing to retreat, he looked to the left to make sure of this. There he saw the commander of the 4th Company in person. The fairy appeared at the most unexpected moment to join her accomplice. Ankrit understood very well that he could not simply defend himself. He immediately moved from his place to strike first and deal with the company commander. The fairy stood motionless and looked at one of her wards, who was approaching her with a sharp knife in his hands at an incredible speed. The killer literally lost control at that moment. He released several dozen poisonous needles to deal with all opponents. Krang at this moment was still on his bed and watched the poisonous needles fly in different directions, trying to reach their target. Ankrit looked behind him and understood that his situation was not the best. The poison was moving towards his skin with tremendous speed. Krang did not have time to react to the danger and helplessly put the sword in front of him, hoping that one of his allies would be able to save him. Ankrit looked at his friend with frightened eyes and realized that he could not survive. In addition, the young man was wondering what his friend should do. Meanwhile, he continued to attack the company commander, who was able to avoid his blow. The woman jumped into the air, taking advantage of her opponent's loss of concentration. The fairy tried to avoid the poisonous needles, but there were too many of them. One of them took aim at her cloak and nailed it to one of the walls. Encred did not understand at all what was happening here. With horror on his face, he looked at the woman who looked like she was going to end his second. Krang sat motionless on his bed, sword in hand, and watched as the fairy stood directly in front of him and began to absorb his opponent's blows. It turned out that the company commander did not cooperate with the killer at all. She protected the white-haired youth by deflecting the needles with a shockwave. Encred was simply shocked by this turn of events. Before that, he was sure that the company commander was with the killer, but the assumptions turned out to be wrong. Coming to his senses a bit, the young man once again gripped the sword tightly in his hands and focused on their mutual opponent, who was closest to him. Encred quickly pushed himself off the ground and headed in the direction of the enemy, putting his right hand in front of him and pointing his sword at the assassin. The man used absolutely all the weapons in his arsenal and did not know what to do. He stood undisturbed, watching the young man. The killer clenched his teeth in surprise. He put the sword in front of him in order to somehow influence the further development of events for himself. At the last moment, the man managed to repel the young man's blow, directing it upwards. The killer was able to survive only thanks to his prudence and professionalism. Despite this, he perfectly understood that he would not be able to continue the fight for a long time because he lacked skills in real combat and even with several opponents. Realizing this fact, the man hastily rose from his place and began to run away from the enemy, who did not understand what had happened. After some time, Encred naturally realized that the killer simply decided to give up and retreat. The young man slowly approached the open entrance to the infirmary. His allies did the same behind his back. The three of them looked at the open tent and understood that they could no longer catch up with the killer. Krang assumed that the killer was coming for his soul today. Encred was not very surprised and replied that it was already clear to him. Krang was a little surprised by his friend's answer. With a frightened face, he looked at the young man and asked how he knew such information. Encred explained that the assassin definitely didn't come for minor warriors like him or Vergans, as they meant absolutely nothing in this war. The fairy noted the cleverness of the young man and agreed with his assumptions. She thanked the young man for his help, but she still looked serious. Suddenly, Encred saw the woman grasp the hilt of her sword. He understood that this could only mean a continuation of today's skirmish. Encred concluded that the fairy wants to cover her tracks, since no one from outside should know and see her movements. Aware of the fact that the witnesses had been cleared, the young man firmly grasped his sword and prepared for the fact that the fairy would fight him to the death. Suddenly, Encred noticed his new companion standing in the way of both of them. The young man was a little surprised and did not understand what would be waiting for him now. Krang turned to face Faye and asked her to wait. In a serious voice, he said that he had one small request for the woman. The white-haired youth smiled and said that he would like to do without deaths today. This text also referred to the young man behind him. Encred looked at his new friend with a surprised look. He understood that he wanted to avoid conflict, but he did not understand why he was protecting him. Hearing the request from Krang, the fairy immediately bowed before him and promised that she would not make any moves until she received approval from the leader. Krang suddenly turned his attention to the platoon leader and asked if he was even alive. The fairy replied that they had an antidote, so he would be fine. Listening to the dialogue of the two allies, Encred realized that the fairy was very good at poisons, and that's why she had to face that assassin more than once. Krang came to the next task. He understood that they needed to clean up the chamber a bit, as the news about tonight would frighten the warriors very much. Encred suddenly interrupted his new friend and proposed a plan for which no traces would be left in the chamber and around it. Encred added that it was a perfectly simple solution after looking at the candle. His allies were surprised and did not understand what he meant at all. The young man simply decided to set fire to the main ward of the medical center, simulating a fire. The chamber began to burn, and the witnesses quickly left the scene of the night tragedy. All the soldiers immediately woke up and saw that the main infirmary was on fire. They began to collect water in buckets and quickly run towards the fire. Meanwhile, Encred and the platoon leader were on the street. The soldiers immediately saw them and realized that they were comatose people who had escaped from the infirmary. Encred kept thinking about the killer, not the fire. He hoped that all traces of the killer were gone, so there would be no more problems with this. The young man was forced to admit that the fulfillment of this task was given to him quite easily, especially since the soldiers will deal with the fire very quickly. It was deep night outside. Thick clouds could be seen here and there, covering the brightly shining mountains. A bird flew in the sky with widespread wings. He seemed to accompany two travelers who left the camp. Krang and the fairy passed through the dense forest, leaving the adventures in the past. The fairy turned to her leader and asked if he had decided to change his mind because of the young man who had saved him. Krang stopped suddenly. He answered positively and added that Ankrid is a very interesting guy, after asking the ward's opinion. The woman did not answer anything and silently looked to the right. Krang did not understand that she saw such a thing there, and also looked in the same direction, continuing to think about his new friend. Meanwhile, the sun was slowly starting to rise from behind the mountains, and Ankrid went to sword training to sharpen his skills. The sun's rays also appeared in the dense forest. After standing still for a while, Krang moved from his place and walked forward with the pouch on his shoulder. The white-haired youth smiled and once again remembered his new friend Enki. He was very grateful to him for his help and for an incredible experience in life. Krang and the fairy walked towards the sunrise. The young man said that he needed to meet with Enkrid again, but in slightly different conditions. Enkrid was able to survive another easy day and was transported to his consciousness. There he saw a scythe of death, which seemed very strange to him. Suddenly she began to dissipate right before his eyes like an illusion. Enkrid was no longer surprised by anything, considering his adventures. After that, the young man saw in front of him the same boat with a ghost, which was constantly moving in front of it and illuminating its territory with a bright blue lantern. Looking closely at the face of his old acquaintance, the young man saw displeasure and seriousness. The ghost said that the young man would soon meet his new acquaintance. Ankrid confidently looked up and answered that he was ready for any meeting. Moreover, this meeting was not about an enemy but an ally. The morning of the next day came, and the young man finally did not hear the song about the war hero. He survived another rough day thanks to his blue artifact. Enkrid went outside and was convinced that the terrible day had passed. He realized this by glancing at the burned infirmary in the center of the camp. Enkrid began packing his things to leave the camp early in the morning. He knew he would have to go through a lot when he returned to his unit. The young man could at least thank fate for the fact that he was absolutely not injured in the battle, and therefore he could immediately go to meet his wards. Suddenly, Enkrid heard a familiar voice and saw Vergennes in front of him. The man asked his savior why he pulled him out of the flames. Ankrid looked at his interlocutor with displeasure and wondered what he had done to him so much that he spoke to him with pretensions even after his rescue. The young man confidently answered that he did it only for his own reasons, because they are both members of the same alliance and need to help each other. Judging by the expression on the platoon leader's face, he definitely didn't like that answer. He felt very uncomfortable because he received a rather comprehensive answer. Vergennes called his savior the bravest bastard ever to save him, even after he constantly pestered him with his words. The platoon commander asked the young man if he was going to leave the infirmary so quickly and go to his unit. Enkrid answered in the affirmative. Suddenly, Vergennes advised not to take hasty actions, emphasizing that today is not the day of the young man. Enkrid returned and asked if something had happened to me. Vergennes said that he has been in this camp for much longer and has heard many rumors that the place is cursed, which he is increasingly convinced of. One of the members of the 444 detachment named Rangi arranged a conflict within the camp. He advised his interlocutor not to joke with him at all. After that, the young man pushed his interlocutor in the shoulder. He turned out to be the partner of the young man, Rem, who remained standing still. On the big man's face, and he understood that the young man wanted to stir up a conflict that the man definitely liked. Rem, at the same second, lifted his partner over his head and called him a little bastard. Rem was ready to launch him far away. All those present around immediately began to run in different directions. The soldiers wondered if these lunatics could not peacefully live a single day without their commander. Rangi landed painfully in one of the nearby tents. The owners of their hut were not happy that the members of the second-rate squad were breaking everything around. Rangi was not going to simply give in to his opponent. He suddenly got up from his seat and hit the big man in the face. Rem was in no way shaken by the last blow. Instead, he delivered a powerful blow in return, from which the young man almost fell backwards. After that, Rem took out axes from his arsenal and told his partner that he was not going to joke with him anymore, so it was necessary to finish the match. Rangi supported the idea of his attacker. He drew a sword from behind his back and held it out in front of him, warning Rem of his imminent death. As soon as the partners faced each other in the first armed duel, their commander appeared on the horizon. Enkrid was not at all surprised by what he saw. The young man absolutely did not believe in the curse of this camp, but considered his wards to be his own curse, which has been haunting him for several months. Ankrid ordered the wards to stop the fight immediately. The soldiers were surprised that the young man returned so quickly from the infirmary and came again to restore order. It had been 4 days since Ankrid had returned to his unit. It was morning outside and the sun slowly rose from behind the mountains. She threw her rays on the face of the commander, who was lying motionless on his bed and had not yet woken up but was about to. Suddenly, the young man opened his eyes wide and looked straight ahead. He heard some strange noises, as if someone had broken into his room. The commander's assumptions turned out to be true. He saw Jackson in front of him, who came to his bed and was about to leave the ward. The man explained to the commander that he wanted to get out as quietly as possible, but it seems that he did not manage to do this, and he asked the young man if his sleep had not been interrupted. Ankrid got up from his bed and replied that he was going to get up just in time and go to training anyway, because the sun had already risen a long time ago. Jackson complimented the commander on the fact that he had only recently been training, but his hearing had greatly improved. Ankrid replied that he had practiced a lot. Jackson advised the young man to continue training because he considered hearing the best weapon that could save the commander in the near future. After a dialogue with his ward, Ankrid went to training. In the morning, he never trained his hearing because there was almost nothing going on around him. Instead, the commander also did not forget to train his body. He used a tree branch instead of a horizontal bar to keep his body in relief. Ankrid held onto the tree with one hand, tucking the other behind his back. In a few minutes, the young man was incredibly sweaty, but the result was worth it. The captain tried to make the most of the time before winter set in, as the command foresaw inevitable battles with the enemy. When Ankrid returned to the camp, he met a huge stone on his way, from under which he heard a greeting of good morning. The young man had just washed and was very surprised when he heard someone's voice. He immediately looked under the stone when he heard a familiar voice from there. Auden was holding a huge rock and was doing push-ups from the floor. He asked the commander if he had already finished his morning training. Literally a few seconds later, the man threw the stone to the ground and stood up to his full height, praising his commander for not wasting time. Ankrid looked at the huge stone with some surprise and skepticism. He did not understand why Auden burdened himself so much with physical health. The commander looked at his charge, and the latter, as if reading the young man's thoughts, said that the pumped-up body itself is already a good weapon. With a smile on his face, Udine added that one needed to have a pumped-up body to withstand the toad's punch, hinting at the enemy in the enemy ranks. Clenching his fist in front of him, the man explained to the captain that he was still too weak, so he needed to keep swinging every day. Ankrid, on the contrary, believed that Auden was too pumped up. However, he did not say this out loud and simply agreed with the opinion of his ward. Auden began to ask the young man and find out whether he was doing the exercises he advised, because they were the most effective in the opinion of the big man. Meanwhile, Rem was also doing his morning workout. He just woke up and immediately started acting just in the sleeping ward. He hit one of his partners who was still sleeping. He turned out to be Rangi, who loved to lie in bed and do nothing. Rem ordered the young man to get up immediately, because today it was his turn to prepare breakfast. Rangi should have woken up several tens of minutes earlier. The young man was in no hurry to wake up despite the screams in the room. He slowly walked on all fours across the floor in the direction of his sword. Rangi grabbed his weapon and started to get to his feet. Rem watched his partner all this time and did not understand whether he was still asleep. Suddenly, the big man saw his ally swinging his sword at him and wanting to strike, advising him to eat fried carnations for breakfast. Rem was not going to stand still and immediately grabbed his axe. He wanted to teach the young man that he did not want to cook. As soon as the two partners wanted to face each other in battle, the commander entered their room with Auden. Ankrid asked if they were fighting again. The captain ordered the wards to immediately calm down and lower their weapons. Taking the icon in his hands, Auden added that brutal violence will lead to absolutely nothing. Rem immediately hurried to explain his behavior. He pointed a finger at his partner and said that he would soon starve them without breakfast. Ankrid ordered Ranga to begin his duties immediately, as everyone does. The young man looked into the steel and had to agree with the commander. Rem was very angry with his partner because he did not want to listen to him earlier. He lifted his shirt and put it right in front of the interlocutor. Rangi did not want to look at his ally's dirty clothes and asked him to take his shirt. He noticed that she smelled a little. Rem sniffed his clothes and concluded that his shirt smelled fine. Ankrid ordered to stop sniffing the shirt and also to stop clinging to people. Rem smiled and replied that his hands were itching to get into some sort of combat, so he decided to practice a bit on his partner. Ankrid replied that it wasn't a very good idea to fall for the first person you met. The young man offered to follow him and engage in friendly sparring. Immediately after the allies left the chamber, thick clouds gathered over the camp. The day was expected to be absolutely not sunny and cheerful. Despite the lousy weather, Ankrid engaged in sparring with his ward. Rem constantly won in duels, delivering powerful blows from the side. Zdrovan got incredible pleasure from the fights. He shouted loudly and advised his commander to hold the blow harder in order to stay on his feet. After that, Rem made a sudden blow with his axe and almost knocked the sword out of the young man's hands, who miraculously managed to keep the weapon in his right hand. Ankrid decided to retreat a little and keep calm. He breathed deeply and used the beast heart technique to calm his nerves. Looking straight ahead, the young man saw an axe coming towards his face. Rem wasn't going to stop and continued to put constant pressure on his opponent. Ankrid was able to react in time to the danger and block the enemy's blow. He used his hearing to better understand the situation. After that, the young man firmly took the sword in his hands and was going to strike the final chord. He wanted to use the blow for which he had paid many lives. Rem was in the most open position, which the commander was going to take advantage of. He wanted to break through the defense of the man, who lost his vigilance for a few seconds. Ankrid made a lunge honed to near perfection, learned from an enemy soldier on the battlefield who cut his throat several times. Despite the enemy's speed, Rem managed to dodge his commander's blow in time. The man leaned back and looked at the sword blade. Afterwards, Rem used his axe to restrain his opponent's movements. He grasped the sword and gained the upper hand on the battlefield. Zdrovan pulled the opponent towards him with an axe and looked at him with a cold, serious look, warning of his imminent victory. Ankrid did not have time to react to the rapid movements of the opponent and ended up in a trap. Rem grabbed him by the collar, and the young man could do absolutely nothing. The captain did not expect that Rem could use such methods in battle. He tried to break free, but the big man held him firmly by the collar. After holding the young man in his arms for a while, Rem powerfully threw him to the ground, keeping his hands on his collar. After that, the big guy said that he expected much more from the young man, since lately he has been getting better and better at sparring with him. Rem asked his sparring partner why he had become so boring. The man was already tired of the same blow that the young man constantly used against him. Ankrid was well aware of his weakness in this sparring match, but that was his goal. After many defeats, he realized one very important thing. Now he has become completely different from what he once was in the past. He was no longer the raw young man who spent days training around a tree, but with no results. Now he could improve his skills by repeating the movements hundreds or even thousands of times. Ankrid suggested another duel and promised to slap the man. Rem was skeptical about the words of his interlocutor. He assessed him with a cold look and clearly understood that the captain still lacked skills. However, there was one important detail that affected health. He saw the serious look of the young man, whom he liked incredibly. This attitude made Rem smile because he never got tired of fighting, and this look spoke of his determination to win the fight. Rem smiled and replied that the commander would only be allowed to say such things after leaving at least a scratch on his face. Before the match started, the rain intensified even more. The drops became bigger and thicker, watering the wide forests around the camp. Ankrid and Rem understood very well that this was not very good weather for training. They were forced to abandon sparring due to unpredictable weather conditions. It was raining so hard that absolutely no one could be found in the camp. Everyone hid in the wards and waited until the sun came out. Ankrid and his wards were no exception, and watched the natural disaster that suddenly loomed over the camp and was not going to stop. Rem dried himself with a dry towel and concentrated on his leg. Looking at his foot, he assumed that this kind of weather would soon cause mushrooms to grow there. Rangi was doing his favorite thing and was lying on the bed. Auden sat next to him with an icon in his hands and silently read prayers. Chris entered the chamber, who was unhappy that he had to constantly postpone matches due to unbearable weather. Wiping his head, the red-haired youth asked the commander if he was ready to believe in the curse that hung over their camp. Ankrid looked at the young man in great surprise and asked what the curse was. Chris asked the commander if he really lived in the bunker and hadn't heard the rumors. Suddenly, Ankrid remembered a conversation with a platoon leader who had said exactly the same thing. The young man heard about the curse for the second time in this camp. Now the words of Vergens did not seem to him invented, especially since the man spoke absolutely seriously and warned him about uncontrollable problems. Chris pointed out that the weather is only getting worse, and their scouting party has lost a lot of people, so everyone keeps talking about the curse. The young man also did not forget to add that he personally does not believe in curses, but if the weather continues to deteriorate, then some measures will have to be taken. Ankrid interrupted his thoughts and suggested that the High Command would not leave such things unheeded. The young man was talking about the intelligence group. Christ suddenly asked the commander why he was standing at the exit. Encred replied that he practiced his senses in this way. The ward asked if it was possible to feel something during this downpour. The captain replied that this is why he practices in the rain. Rem couldn't understand why such skills were needed at all. He called the commander a wild cat who would never need extra eyes on his back. Jackson denied this information and praised the captain for a rather good way of training. Rem looked at his partner with a displeased look. Encred continued to stare out the window while his charges quarreled among themselves. Now he could not even hear the rain because of the unbearable screams of the wards. Suddenly Auden turned to the captain and offered him another way to practice in the tent. Rangi was also happy to join in the advice. Rem looked at his partners with a very displeased look. He did not understand, since when they all began to worry about the captain. Jackson, who always lived alone in their unit and never shared his experience with a member of the unit, was the most surprising to the big man. Auden, of course, was much kinder, but he had never helped the commander before, but only called him a thin and unpumped guy. Rangi generally did not care about the problems and the rest of the events. He was just going about his business and resting. But now for some reason he began to change. Rem smiled and wondered if he had started dancing to their commander's tune as well, since he sparred with him every time. Encred still continued to stand by the exit and listen to the sounds outside. Rem admitted that their captain had really changed a lot in the past few days. The rain did not stop for a second. High Command gathered in the chamber to discuss very important matters, given the latest developments in intelligence. The commander-in-chief was stressing that one more reconnaissance unit should be equipped before winter came. He asked if anyone had any suggestions. For some time, the fairy did not dare to speak a word, but at some point she proposed the candidacy of the commander of the 4th Squad of the 4th Platoon of the 4th Company. The man was very surprised because he knew this young man as a completely untalented and unintelligent soldier who can only interfere with intelligence. The fairy explained to the commander-in-chief that it can bring very good results. The captain asked the woman why she thought that in the first place. Standing up to her full height and placing her hand on the table, Fairy looked confidently at the interlocutor and said that she only trusted her sense of fairy. Yesterday finally ended with the continuous rain. The morning of the next day came and the sun set the alarm clock for all the soldiers in the camp. Encred to him. She told him about the meeting and about his new appointment. The young man was simply shocked when he heard that they wanted to add him to the reconnaissance group. He could not have expected such a turn of events. The fairy sat motionless at the table and coldly looked into the face of her ward. Her expression indicated that she was absolutely serious. Returning to his chamber, Encred immediately began to prepare for his journey. One of the wards asked if he really angered the company commander so much. Encred asked the interlocutor how he understood this. Christ made such conclusions because it was the captain who was decided to be added to the reconnaissance group. Encred remembered the face of the fairy before him and hoped that she had not decided to finish him off after Krang had left the camp. The commander of the scum squad stared blankly in front of him and understood the logic of his charge, but he didn't want to even think about something like that just yet. Encred continued to gather in silence and was suddenly interrupted by Remus. Zdrovan asked the captain if he was really going to go scouting. Holding the axe in his hands, Rem asked the commander if he had any idea that he could help him with this problem. Encred perfectly understood what the big deal was leading to. He advised him to just sit still and not even think about cutting the company commander's throat with an axe. Encred suddenly heard Auden reciting his prayer before the icon, asking God why he was taking their commander to his inevitable death. The captain could not understand what was happening to his charges. Suddenly, Rangi, who started getting up from his bed, decided to intervene in the dialogue. The young man confidently said that he could help the commander and solve his problem. He was just going to scout for him and save his life. Encred was absolutely against such an idea, because I understand that the company commander will not support Rangi's candidacy, given his character. Jackson decided to simply help the commander with advice and explain to him that the reconnaissance would mainly take place in fields with extremely tall grass. The treacherous warrior advised the young man to listen carefully to the grass and notice any sounds that might indicate the presence of an enemy ambush nearby. Rem got angry with his partner because of his advice. Cheers couldn't stand Jackson teaching their commander bad things anymore. Encred closed his eyes and thought about the fact that now his charges were beating each other. He had no idea who could calm them down. In the end, the young man had to agree that no one is better suited to this mission than he, because he has the incredible ability of the blue artifact. Encred recalled how after joining the army he had very few skills, so he was constantly being bounced between units to fill in the gaps. Back then, Rem and his current partners were in a unit under a different command. Zdrovan then behaved very brazenly and constantly got into arguments. Once Jackson was not his rivals. The man flew to meet his opponent with a knife in his hands, intending to finish off the scum as well. He moved forward without stopping and quickly shuffled his feet. There was not a single person in the entire army who could influence this course of events. Suddenly, both men were forced to stop, seeing a new acquaintance in front of them. They didn't understand what was going on. Just happened to be standing between their weapons. He interrupted the conflict of his wards, although he risked his life at that moment. Encrid asked the men to lower their weapons and introduced himself as their new commander. Since then, the young man held his position for a long time. Rem treated the new commander with skepticism and advised him not to do so again, because either the bravest or complete fools enter their conflict. Jackson then advised his partner to thank the captain, because if it weren't for the young man, he would have ended up lying in a coffin because of his stupidity and imprudence. Despite the stupidity of his wards, Encrid immediately realized that they were very capable guys. Compared to them, he was just an ant on the battlefield. The commander of the second-class detachment spent his last night in the rogue's ward. He tried not to think about what the men would do without him in the ward. The morning of the next day came very quickly, and the commander had to get up to go on a journey with the scouting party. A reconnaissance group of 7 people quickly gathered and went on a mission. Encrid was one of the first to go, listening to literally every sound. He was behind the commander who went first. The man immediately noticed that the new ward had closed his eyes and was listening to something. Encrid was suddenly forced to interrupt his training when the squad captain turned to him and ordered him to pack up as he moved forward. Andrew Gardner was the commander of the reconnaissance unit and warned the young man that they were usually of the same rank, but his unit was very different from the others. Members of the squad immediately began to mock the newcomer. They thought he didn't even know how to hold a gun, since he was only a secondary member in the army. Andrew Gardner smiled impudently and said that he would not beat the young man half to death if he wanted to fight, but he would leave him alone in these thickets. Suddenly, the man shouted loudly and ordered his wards to break the skull when meeting with the enemy. The wards immediately gave feedback, obeying the captain. Encrid was simply shocked by the behavior of the commander. He wondered if the man even knew the word intelligence if he used such loud exclamations during a mission. Suddenly, one of the wards, who was exploring the surrounding area, saw strange single tracks and immediately reported it to the commander of the reconnaissance unit. Andrew Gardner immediately rushed to check the find. He crouched over the inexplicable tracks and concluded that they might be nude tracks. The commander was very happy, because this was a sign that they would have a barbecue tonight. The man ordered to go after this animal. Encrid knew that Nu moved in packs of 20 or more people. He wondered if the commander really wanted to encounter these dangerous animals. The man to the left of the newcomer snorted in disbelief. He said in a low voice that it didn't look like nude marks at all. According to a squad member, it was obviously a gazelle. Encrid looked at the man with an untrusting look and did not understand why he went against the commander in the first place. A man named Henry from the intelligence unit did not really trust his commander and asked the newcomer how he was supposed to cooperate with such a man. Encrid and Henry quickly became friends, and the latter told about his experience as a hunter. They very quickly found a common language and began to communicate on various topics. Encrid learned from his new friend the basics of the hunting craft, which turned out to be very useful. Henry promised to show a lot in practice tonight. The evening passed imperceptibly in search of a Nu, and outside it was already night. The reconnaissance team continued the search, but did not achieve any success at all. They spent the whole day looking for nudes that do not exist in these forests. The captain of the reconnaissance unit jeopardized the mission and wasted a lot of time. The members of the detachment had already gone to sleep on the wet ground, and Andrew Gardner was still absolutely sure that he had come across the tracks of the NU a few hours before. The man literally could not find a place for himself because he needed to somehow justify his behavior. Encrid lay on the ground and silently watched the commander. The night passed quite quietly, if we did not take into account the overly emotional squad leader. The surrounding space gradually brightened as the solar peak approached. The reconnaissance squad woke up very early and immediately went to meet the adventurers, because they needed to bring at least some information to the main headquarters. After a couple of hours, the soldiers reached the border with their enemies. In front of them stretched a huge grass, through which absolutely nothing was visible. Andrew Gardner told his wards that they had a task to explore the area around, which in their region was called the Green Pearl. In fact, it was a high field overgrown with tall grass. She represented absolutely nothing, except a possible trap from the enemy. The wards were very skeptical of their leader's decision, but no one said anything. They just stood there and waited for the next order. Andrew Gardner suddenly called out and announced that they were to cross the whole field and capture the enemy in order to receive a reward on their return. Henry asked his new friend if they were really going to go there, since they were only supposed to scout within their borders. Oncreed walked slowly and confidently to the tall grass and unfurled it in front of him, reminding his partner that this was their commander's order. The detachment of the reconnaissance group was forced to go to the meeting for some unknown reason. They saw absolutely no one and nothing around them. Andrew Gardner, as a leader, walked in front of the entire squad and pushed the grass on his way, leading his wards in his own footsteps. Oncreed assumed that the commander would soon admit defeat and turn back, but he continued to advance regardless. Henry continued to survey the area along the way and reported seeing very little wildlife droppings. Oncreed asked what it was all about. Henry explained that this meant that the animals hardly ever walked here, which was very surprising, since there was so much food around that was completely at their disposal. Oncreed really thought about the words of his partner and began to listen more closely to every sound that could only be heard in the thick grass. Suddenly, somewhere inside the thickets, there was still one wild animal. A large cat's paws stepped on the ground, as if fleeing from something terrible. Oncreed immediately heard a suspicious sound and became alert. He realized that problems were waiting for them, which could not be avoided in any way. As long as the young man was standing still, a wild black cat, similar to a panther, flashed just in front of him. She ignored the people and just ran on. Oncreed turned his frightened eyes towards the animal and wanted to understand what had frightened it so much that it did not even pay attention to them. Looking at the cat, the young man saw her frightened blue eyes, which were quite similar to the eyes of the predator. Oncreed immediately understood that the cat was being hunted. Based on his assumptions, the young man shouted loudly, ordering his partners to immediately duck. He even grabbed the squad leader by the head. The novice's assumptions turned out to be absolutely correct, and one of the squad members was immediately hit by an arrow in the head, which he did not even have time to blink an eye. The first was followed by the second, which caught another member of the squad by surprise. The partners could not understand what was happening in this thick grass. Andrew Gardner began to understand the seriousness of the situation. The captain began to panic when he realized that they were in mortal danger. Looking just behind him, the commander of the reconnaissance group saw enemies making their way through the grass, approaching them very quickly. Gardner's visage with a crossbow in his hands. The enemies wore helmets on their heads, which were well known to the Allies. The representatives of the enemy reconnaissance unit very quickly found their targets and stopped in front of the grass when they felt absolute silence around them. The reconnaissance team, led by Andrew Gardner, realized that they needed to get out of here immediately to save as many lives as possible. Despite the speed, some members of the squad could not escape from the enemies. Among the injured was Andrew Gardner, who was immediately captured by the opponents. Oncreed moved in front of the entire squad, sword in hand, cutting his way. He perfectly understood that in this situation they could not do without victims. The enemy continued to take the lives of the young man's partners. Henry also failed to withstand the onslaught and was killed as he tried to get his feet off the field. Oncreed was very frightened, realizing that he was completely alone. Even the most experienced scouts could not cope with the enemy's trap. The enemy prepared very well and gathered many people who knew the thickets to the squad. They made their way through the grass they knew as their native homes. Enemies began to surround their single goal from different sides. Oncreed just ran forward, unaware that in a few seconds he would be completely surrounded. Oncreed ran through the tall grass without looking back. He was pursued by dozens of enemies who were ready to tear him to pieces at any moment. In addition, they were equipped with crossbows. One of the soldiers at some point took out his weapon and quickly loaded an arrow inside. Oncreed immediately heard the sound. He realized that he was in danger and was able to make out clearly that it was the sound of an arrow. The sensibilities he learned from Jackson definitely served him well. The young man was able to avoid the arrow thanks to the fact that he heard the crossbow. However, the adventures did not end there. Oncreed heard many sounds around him, but could not clearly understand what was happening. There were so many sounds that the young man was literally confused in this chaos. He was visibly sweating because he had been running forward for a long time. Literally after a few seconds, Oncreed found himself in a hopeless situation. At the last moment, he felt dozens of arrows around him, but he could not do anything. He didn't even try to avoid being hit as it was inevitable. All those arrows had now stuck into his body and damaged his internal organs. Oncreed felt an unbearable pain inside him, but he did not despair because he understood that this same day was waiting for him tomorrow. The young man decided to suggest that Andrew Gardner change their strategy. However, the man was against it, because he only considered himself the commander of this detachment. Ankrid received a negative response to his proposal and realized that he would have to act alone to save himself at least. Each time the reconnaissance team went to the tall grass and met the enemies there, Andrew Gardner shouted, ordering his men to retreat. Ankrid tried to hide in different ways, but the enemies time and again calculated and stopped him, taking his life. The other members of the squad couldn't help either, as they not only lacked experience, but also lacked the strength to fight multiple enemies. Ankrid was not disappointed, and every time he tried to find a way around the trap, several times in a row, he ran into the crossbowman directly opposite. 20 soldiers shot him at the same time. On the western part of the field, there were shooters who hit their targets several times in a row. After that, the next day, the young man decided to go north to avoid meeting with crossbowmen. However, here he met the infantry, who pierced him with spears. For a certain day, he still managed to survive after a clash with soldiers. The young man could barely move on the ground, picking at the tips of his fingers. Even though Ankrid managed to escape from the soldiers wounded, they continued to search for him, dead or alive. Ankrid kept thinking about the uniforms of the soldiers, which were painted green, as if they were not accidentally guarding them and waiting for a long time. The young man walked forward and thought about what enemies could be guarding here. There was absolutely nothing but tall grass. Suddenly, Ankrid saw a flash of light in front of him and realized that there was a civilization nearby. It was a real surprise in the wild. When the young man fell on a slightly visible area, he saw in front of him several flags made of clothes, which were all stained with blood. Ankrid was just shocked and didn't know what it even meant. He only managed to notice the flags hanging on a large pole. As soon as the young man began to examine the territory in more detail, one of the soldiers caught up with him and at the same moment cut his throat with his sharp sword. Ankrid stopped halfway to solving this mystery. His hand lay in a pool of blood spat upon by the unworthy heavenly soldiers. The next day, the young man again went on a trip with a scouting group. Andrew Gardner, as usual, ordered the enemy to be captured and taken to a hiding place. Ankrid already went to this dense field again and was quite skeptical because every time he died hopelessly. He managed to find out that the celestial bastards were hiding something in these dense thickets. Ankrid set himself the goal of finding out exactly what they were hiding there. The young man thought for a few seconds that maybe he shouldn't go on this mission. Henry tried to talk to his new friend. Ankrid, however, decided not to deviate from his goal, as was inherent in him. He gathered his strength and is ready to die many times. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by Andrew Gardner, who shouted at the newcomer in a displeased voice and asked what he was doing now. Suddenly, one of the squad members approached the young man and asked him to calm down, explaining that the commander is sometimes emotional, but you just have to put up with it. Ankrid replied that there was one problem with this situation. He was going to put up with this jerk until a certain moment, but his nerves were eternal. The interlocutor was simply shocked when the newcomer asked him if he was tired of licking the ass of the commander, who was absolutely worthless. The man held back his emotions as Ankrid pulled him to the right side and told him that he wasn't going to play their commander's silly games anymore. Andrew Gardner was not happy about what was happening. He reached for his weapon and asked the newcomer if he was refusing to obey orders. Ankrid took a few confident steps forward and replied that that was exactly what he was going to do. The young man wanted to radically change the situation. That is why he confidently said that from now on he will give orders. Ankrid believed that this was the only way they would be able to overcome their opponents. Andrew Gardner was incredibly angry with his ward. Ankrid knew that the current commander was quite capable and managed to survive the longest. He also did not forget about Henry and another soldier, who were the strongest in the reconnaissance squad and survived almost at the same level as the commander. Ankrid especially paid attention to the defender of the current commander, who looked very powerful and reminded him of Rem from the former squad. Andrew Gardner agreed to the newcomer's adventure, but he had his conditions. He told him to get a weapon and deal with everything as fair as possible. Ankrid immediately carefully examined his opponent's stance. He saw that it was very well taught, so it was necessary to be as careful as possible. The young man also noticed that their current captain was extremely inexperienced, so he could conclude that he was the son of some rich lord or official. However, he suddenly remembered that Gardner was very concerned about the outcome of the mission and wanted to serve himself, so this option was immediately dropped. Andrew asked his opponent how such a badass was able to rise to the rank of squad leader without even basic combat skills. Ankrid still continued to think about the origin of his opponent, but finally abandoned these attempts and completely switched to the current battlefield. Meanwhile, the current commander of the reconnaissance unit was very angry. He shouted loudly, announcing that he got everything only because of hard work. Encred interrupted his opponent and said that he was talking a lot. After that, he waved his finger and offered to attack first, adding that he would not need the match. Andrew Gardner became even more angry with his opponent. He immediately moved from his place and hastened to teach the enemy, who behaves as insolently as possible. Encred perfectly understood that his opponent had very good skills, and in a calm and fair fight, he would definitely lose to him. However, the young man perfectly saw that the commander underestimated him and was eager to fight. Encred understood that his underdog status would only help him in this fight. He stood motionless in place, fists clenched in a fighting stance. He carefully observed the enemy, who was in a great hurry at the beginning of the battle. Andrew Gardner approached the enemy at the right distance and swung his sword with all his might, but due to his haste he was unable to land an accurate blow. Encred, of course, took advantage of his opponent's recklessness and threw his weapon upwards. For this, he needed only the elbow of his left hand. Andrew Gardner was simply shocked. Now he was completely unprotected and realized that he had underestimated his opponent. Encred did not spare a single second and immediately delivered a powerful blow with a right elbow straight to the chest of his opponent, who was completely defenseless in this situation. The commander of the reconnaissance squad screamed from the pain in his chest. Saliva flew out of his mouth from the incredible pressure in his chest. Literally in a few seconds, the battle was already over. Andrew Gardner was lying on the ground, clutching his chest and curled up on the floor. The right-hand man of the commander was simply shocked by such a result of the battle. Henry did not expect to see such a thing because he thought that Encred got into this unit by accident. After finishing the duel, the young man looked at all the members of the squad and asked if they had any questions for the new commander of the reconnaissance group. Henry still couldn't get over the shock. Of course, he did not have any questions because he did not like the previous leader as much as possible with his orders. The strongest member of the squad looked down and said absolutely nothing. Now he had absolutely nothing against the newcomer who had become the leader. Andrew Gardner, meanwhile, recovered from his defeat and began to climb. The man was visibly sweating and could not understand how he lost this fight. His deputy inhaled and exhaled slowly, understanding the situation. He said that he was fully prepared to obey the orders of the new leader of the intelligence group. Encred fulfilled his task without question, taking the first step towards the next day. Now the entire squad was completely in his hands. After this short skirmish, the reconnaissance group went into the field. They were here for the first time and did not know where they were going. Encred could take advantage of his experience. Now he walked ahead of everyone and kept Andrew Gardner constantly at his back. The detachment went forward for almost an hour and met absolutely nothing. Scouts were already beginning to express dissatisfaction with the new leader. At some point, Encred began to speak to his wards and first asked Henry what his dream was for the near future. Henry was just shocked to hear such a question. In response, he asked the new commander why he should answer such things at all. In the end, the man said that he would like to marry a beautiful girl and have a family. Encred said he needed to survive today to do that. One of the squad members reported that he already has a child. Encred explained to him that the child needs a father and therefore the man must survive at any cost. The leader asked the same question to two more team members. One of them wanted to start his own business, and the other just wanted to go home. Finally, it came to Andrew. The former commander replied that he wanted to fulfill his mother's last wish. Looking at the commander with confident eyes, Andrew Gardner explained that his mission is to revive the famous Gardner House. Encred stopped in one place and said that all the dreams and goals of his wards have one thing in common. They need to survive today's mission. A dead silence reigned between the interlocutors. No one dared to interrupt the commander, who was saying absolutely reasonable things on the eve of a deadly battle. Encred raised his head high and looked at each of his wards, telling them all to gather their strength and set out to meet their dreams and goals. Andrew Gardner had nothing to object to the new commander. Absolutely all members of the detachment were shocked and at the same time impressed by the speech of a very young warrior. Encred understood that he needed motivated fighters on the battlefield. The young man knew that there is nothing more motivating than the lust for life. Suddenly, the squad leader turned to Henry and asked him to shoot in the direction of the north, indicating the direction with his finger. The man did not understand why is this necessary? Encred looked at the ward with a cold, angry look and warned that he would not repeat it twice, so it is better to carry out the orders immediately. Not understanding why, Henry shot in the same direction as the commander pointed. The arrow flew exactly at the level of the average person's head. Encred knew perfectly well where the enemy was hiding from his past experience. The arrow landed exactly in the head of one of the enemies who were in ambush at that time. Henry was just shocked when he saw that he had actually hit the target. The members of the reconnaissance unit saw the enemy and immediately began to panic. Encred knew what was going to happen and immediately ordered his wards to go after him. The young man made his way through the tall grass, drawing his sword. Andrew Gardner had no idea what was going on. At the same time, he was impressed by the feeling of the new commander, who accurately pointed his finger at the target. Encred knew from previous experience that he needed to change his plan, so now he decided to attack first and catch the enemies by surprise. For several of his deaths, the young man clearly remembered where the enemies were, so without even thinking, he directed the sword in front of him and just ran forward. The enemy found himself exactly in the place where the commander of the reconnaissance unit struck. The sword hit the man in the back, who did not even have time to look back. Encred immediately hurried to pull the weapon from the enemy's back and move on. He needed to attack the enemy units before they noticed the opponents. Encred felt very confident on the battlefield due to his previous experience. He cut the throats of his opponents without any hesitation. One of them suddenly noticed the enemy behind him and wondered what was going on. It was the commander who ordered to kill everyone. As soon as the man spoke his last word, he said goodbye to life. Andrew Gardner went behind the opponent and turned on the sword right at his throat. The problems did not end there, and the former captain was attacked by the enemy. He swung his spear to finish off the enemy. However, Andrew Gardner's bodyguard could not allow his comrade and leader to die, so he rushed to his aid and cut off the soldier's head. Encred knew that with this man, the chances of victory would be much greater. He behaved on the battlefield like a true and strongest warrior. From the very beginning, there were 20 enemies on the battlefield. The reconnaissance squad was able to reduce their number to 8 thanks to the skills of each member of the squad. Finally, they met the last enemies in front of them, who were simply shocked by the events on the battlefield. They could not understand where their allies had gone. Meanwhile, the reconnaissance squad was advancing. Encred knew perfectly well where the enemies were, so he quickly hurried to deal with them. Finally, the scouting party led by the young man stepped out onto the trodden path and saw the enemies in front of them, who looked scared to death. Looking ahead with a cold, serious gaze, the squad captain ordered his charges to kill anyone they saw directly in front of them. As soon as the captain's order sounded, all the members of the reconnaissance squad moved from their places and began to cut the enemy to pieces, showing no mercy to them. The soldiers could not do anything about their opponents. They were usually in the majority, but the effect of surprise played a cruel joke on them. Encred understood that it was also very difficult to find someone in a field with tall enemy grass. They succeeded only because the forces of nature helped them. At some point, the enemy soldier noticed a wild animal behind him and was very scared. At first, he assumed it might be an enemy. His assumption turned out to be unsuccessful, and it was an ordinary wild cat, the same animal that frightened Encred and preceded his death. The enemy soldier could not stand still at this moment and immediately charged at the animal, pointing his sharp spear directly at it. Encred was a few minutes ahead of the events, so he managed to save the cat. He killed the man before he could harm the innocent animal. At that moment, the young man remembered how he was scared of this very beast when it ran past him. Then he had no idea what had happened. It turned out that the man he had just slaughtered was after an innocent animal and wanted to kill it on the spot to fix one major problem. Looking at the cat, Encred understood that the enemies had found them completely by accident the first time. The cat just stumbled upon them in the thick grass. This time the captain was one step ahead of his enemies. Now they managed to use the cat to their advantage and turn the tide of events on the battlefield. While Encred saved the innocent animal, his wards dealt with the rest of the opponents. Henry informed the captain that they were done with the duel. After checking the work of his wards, the captain said that it was time to move on. Meanwhile, the same cat was sneaking up behind him. She looked in the direction of the reconnaissance squad, as if thanking her savior. Encred saved the life not only of himself, but also of an innocent animal. The reconnaissance unit lost one soldier on the battlefield. There were 6 of them left, which was pretty good considering the number of enemies on the battlefield. Thanks to the repetition of the same day, Encred knew very well the number and location of enemy units in the grass. Walking along the already trodden path, the commander suddenly moved from his place and delivered a powerful blow with his sword, cutting the enemy's throat in the bushes. After that, the young man ordered his wards to follow him, changing the direction. He understood that it was necessary to bypass the crossbowmen who were sitting in ambush in the east. The reconnaissance unit dealt with the infantry, which constantly encountered the young man in the north. Encred planned to gradually withdraw from the encirclement by moving forward. Andrew Gardner certainly followed the new captain's orders. He behaved as bravely as possible on the battlefield, entering any skirmish in the first place. His bodyguard could see that Andrew was already at the limit of his capabilities, and therefore very soon he could become a burden rather than a help to them. That is why the big man expressed his opinion and advised the commander to get out of the thick grass until the sun went down and they could still see something. Encred did not agree and said to go on. The ward objected and said that they were getting deeper and deeper. Encred replied that he understood perfectly well. The captain said that his order must be obeyed silently and unquestioningly, just following along. The man did not really like this attitude towards himself. Suddenly, the other members of the squad literally jumped up in surprise. The conflict continued, and therefore, its acute continuation was a rather expected option. The strongest member of the squad put the sword to the neck of the commander and asked him to think again about his decision so that he would not regret it in the next world. The man added that he is not going to follow the commander to his death and will be able to survive, even if he has to finish off the squad commander. Encred replied to the interlocutor that he himself should understand that it is too late to turn back along the trodden road because they may be noticed. The commander emphasized that an enemy unit had already come across their trail, so they are trapped. The ward asked what the young man would offer now. Encred first took the hand of his ward and asked him to lower his weapon and continue the dialogue in a more comfortable environment. The commander explained to his charges that he also values his life, so he will not make rash decisions and put all members of the squad at risk. Andrew Gardner listened carefully to the young man. He remembered how he had previously considered him an absolutely inept soldier and a useless intelligence officer. This made the man think about his late father, who got addicted to alcohol and simply gave up, losing all his wealth and the family home. However, now he looked at the young man and understood that he was not like that at all. He turned out to be a very capable commander and an incredibly talented scout. Andrew remembered the last words of his father before he died, who admitted that he had lost absolutely everything and that their famous house had come to an end. The young man sat over his father's body and listened to him attentively. The man believed that his son would understand and act as he decided before his death. The father said that Andrew should become a person who leads others and, having won the trust of other people, should restore the Gardner family. The young man looked at his father with tears and hatred in his eyes. Before his death, he forgave him for all his actions and realized that it was necessary to move forward constantly. Now in front of him stood Encred, who embodied all the ideal traits for Gardner. The young man asked to believe in him, and then they would be able to survive this hell together. Surprisingly, Andrew Gardner was the first to take part in the parade. He confidently said that he trusted the young man and was ready to follow him. Encred could not have expected that Andrew would be the first to take his side. It definitely boosted his commanding spirit. The strongest member of the squad asked the former captain what the matter was. Andrew replied that Encred was their captain at the moment. Gardner was certainly not the best interlocutor and ward, but in this case he agreed to follow the orders of the new squad commander without question. The man was simply shocked because he did not recognize the character of the past captain. In the end, he was forced to agree after Andrew's words. Encred sat down and advised his charges to do the same. He said, "And you crouch behind him until he gives the appropriate signal." The members of the reconnaissance unit did not understand what they were going to do at all. Despite this, they silently carried out the order of the ward and pressed him to the earth. Seizing the initiative was the first step to today's survival. Encred was able to gain an advantage on the difficult battlefield before sunset. Now came the second stage, and the squad moved through the thickets behind their commander, who explained absolutely nothing, but simply continued to move on. There was absolutely nothing visible ahead. Only the sun fell on the thick grass, hitting the eyes with glare and showing the powerlessness of man in the wild. Encred continued to move steadily forward and finally came upon a well-trodden path. The captain understood very well that there were traces of enemy units. The reconnaissance team encountered the enemy in tall grass. From here, dozens of spears were visible, which were raised to the sky with a sharp side. The squad members were not happy with what they saw. Encred took his wards to a critical point, which he noticed after several attempts. The strongest member of the squad could not understand how the commander manages to constantly lead them behind the enemy's back. Now the situation has become much more important. Encred chose the right moment to enter this point. He had no other choice but to penetrate to the very heart of the enemy units. The reconnaissance unit was sitting literally at a distance of several meters from the enemy. They behaved as quietly as possible, trying not to reveal their location. Encred was positioned in front of his wards, and several tracks passed right next to his face. The young man was able to calculate everything to the smallest detail. One of the enemy units simply walked past their enemies, without noticing any suspicious detail. Encred managed to stick to his idea. His squad was located right between two enemy groups that surrounded them from different sides. However, the enemy themselves did not understand this at all. All the members of the reconnaissance squad were visibly sweating while sitting in the ambush. They understood that at any moment the enemy could notice them and catch them by surprise. Encred was also perfectly aware of the risks he was taking. The young man watched the opponents with frightened eyes, hoping to remain unnoticed. In the end, the squad leader's plan worked perfectly. Enemy groups passed them by. Now they were completely alone in the field. The members of the scouting party could breathe a sigh of relief when their opponents left. They finally heard no rustling in the thick grass. Encred continued to remain on guard. Having made sure that the enemies had gone in different directions, the young man began to think about the last stage. The sun had dipped below the horizon very quickly, and it was the perfect time to finish the plan that Encred had been pondering for several lifetimes. The reason why they could not get out of the thick grass was well known to the young man. Moving forward, the captain stopped and announced that they had arrived. The wards were absolutely not happy with this turn of events. Looking in front of them, they were very upset and scared for the next few minutes. They came right into the heart of the enemy camp, where the lanterns were burning. None of the scouts could even imagine where the new captain would lead them. Encred learned that Aspen soldiers were killing everyone in that field so that no one would be able to find out the location of this camp that was in the field. Looking more closely, the young man saw the same picture from the past in front of him. Now he could see more clearly what was in the very center of the camp. Torn fabrics developed into winds in which attached to a wooden structure. There was dried blood on them, which was more than a few days old. There were wooden sticks to which human bones were tied. It looked terrible, considering the number of skulls still on the floor. After surveying the area, Encred told his men to follow him. Andrew Gardner was very scared, but he doesn't mind the new commander. The reconnaissance squad emerged from their ambush with weapons in hand. Encred had boundless hope that they would unravel this mystery and finally return home. The reconnaissance group infiltrated the enemy camp. The wards immediately understood that their commander wanted to burn the enemy's lair to the ground. Zdrovan was absolutely against such an idea. He called the commander crazy, because they would sooner be finished than they would have time to set fire to anything. Encred suddenly asked his ward what his name was. Zdrovan looked at the captain in surprise and said his name, Mac. Looking ahead, the captain of the reconnaissance group addressed the ward by name and informed him that he would no longer tolerate his antics. Just as Mac was about to jump up and get even with the commander, he was stopped by Andrew Gardner and told the big man to shut his mouth immediately. While Mac stood in complete shock, Andrew followed the new commander. Zdrovan was absolutely shocked by the decision of his former boss. In the end, he had no choice but to join this adventure. I didn't understand that he was unlikely to get out of the enemy squad on his own. Looking up at the sky, Max saw the black clouds with which the moon was hiding and realized that he had only to trust the commander in this complete darkness. Just a few steps away, Encred stopped and waved his sword in the direction of the tent. The young man cut one of the enemy's houses in half. Mac kept moving forward and didn't understand why the captain had cut the awning in the first place. It looked absolutely ridiculous and made no sense at all. Zdrovan thought that the young man would thereby give away their location, but there was no one inside the tent, which seemed very strange for the enemy camp. As they continued to run forward, Mac kept wondering how their commander knew where to run. They were all here for the first time and did not know the area. However, Encred continued to run forward as if he had been here several times. The young man did not even look around to check for enemies. Mac considered the commander to be completely insane because he calmly walks around the enemy camp and does not worry that they can be killed at any moment. Zdrovan could not believe that they still had not met any enemy on their way. He had already begun to doubt that this was the camp of their opponents. Suddenly, Encred stopped and put his hand out in front of him, giving a sign to his wards. They finally arrived at the very heart of the camp. The squad leader turned to face his charges and ordered them to stay here. This seemed very strange considering the number of enemies around the flag. Encred had already penetrated this camp several times. After several dozen attempts, he managed to reach the mysterious flag and even touch it. As soon as he did so, the enemy squad immediately charged at him with all their might. All the attention of the opponents was focused only on him because of this flag. Encred explained to his wards that the soldiers of the sky are hiding their flag in this field, which they are not going to show to anyone outside. The young man added that the main goal of their enemies is to protect this flag, which is in the very center of the camp and is the most guarded. Mac didn't understand what was going on. The man could not believe that the young man had somehow learned about the flag without ever being here. Suddenly, one thought came to the ward. She seemed to enlighten him and set him on the right path in investigating the identity of his captain. Mac assumed that the scum commander had received all the information from the company commander, and only then had he been added to the reconnaissance group. Encred said in a calm and quiet voice that the soldiers of the sky would do their best to protect their flag when even an outsider approached it. Mac looked at the commander and assumed he was on a secret mission where he was ordered to take command and infiltrate an enemy camp. Encred was going to divert the enemy's attention to this incomprehensible flag, and in this battle commotion wanted to go with his wards to a safe place. The commander ordered the wards to divide into two groups. One of them was supposed to become a decoy and distract the attention of the enemies, and the other to burn the tents. Mac was unexpectedly the first to react to the commander's order. He volunteered and wanted to be a member of the decoy team. Encred looked at his ward in great surprise. He didn't expect his biggest nemesis to suddenly decide to switch sides. Before that, the young man only noticed how Mac constantly expressed his displeasure, and this time he suddenly decided to cooperate, which was obviously a plus. Encred penetrated this camp many times each time, but he never managed to keep his squad close to full strength. Now everything was completely different. On his side stood 5 soldiers who looked as charged as possible and were ready to carry out every order of the commander. It was the best schedule of events imaginable. Encred had a very good feeling that they would finally be able to complete this mission. Having understood their roles, the reconnaissance group began the assault. One of the squad members powerfully launched a rock that landed directly on the guard's head. Mac entered the fight first and was immediately noticed. The enemy with a torch in his hands shouted loudly, informing his allies about the outsiders in the camp. The enemy squad immediately began to group and focus on their target. They took weapons in their hands and began to chase the man who broke into their territory. Encred, meanwhile, was approaching the torch near the tent. He became a member of the arson group. The commander tried to act as quickly and confidently as possible. In just a few seconds, the young man was near his goal. He reached forward and was about to grab the handle to lift. Taking the flaming weapon in his hands, Encred raised it above his head and thought that tomorrow he would finally be able to wake up to a new day. However, the young man's conclusions turned out to be hasty, but behind him suddenly appeared the unexpected figure of a man who swung a sword from behind. Encred immediately felt his presence and was very frightened. He did not understand how this was even possible because he listened carefully to every sound. The man delivered a powerful blow with his axe to teach the uninvited guest. He was not going to let the opponents go and let them set fire to the tents. Encred somehow managed to avoid a collision with the sword. He quickly jumped back and the enemy only cut the torch in his hand in two. The young man was simply shocked at how quietly and quickly the enemy behaved. He couldn't hear him in the complete silence around him. Encred immediately reached for his sword as he faced his opponent. He understood that a very difficult battle with a man unknown to him awaited him. For all his attempts to penetrate the camp, the young man had never seen the warrior who was now standing in front of him, causing a feeling of fear and helplessness. Encred saw his powerful body and the sharp sword which he wielded with great skill. This made him think that he might be too strong. When the stranger looked up, his face resembled a devil. He turned to the young man and called him a rat who will pay for all his actions. Encred made absolutely no reply to his opponent. He quietly muttered to himself, something interesting was about to happen in the camp. The stranger understood absolutely nothing. Suddenly, he noticed a flame to his right and immediately glanced there out of wild surprise. Despite the fact that Encred was unable to take part in the fire operation, the fire still began to spread from ward to ward, enveloping the soldiers in panic. The members of the enemy squad immediately began to stir, running in different directions. They tried to put out the fire, which was spreading more and more around. Suddenly, one of the opponents noticed several more uninvited guests. Andrew Gardner, along with another member of the detachment, were already trying to leave the camp. The man standing across from Encred ordered the soldiers to leave the uninvited guests and focus their attention on extinguishing the fire completely. The squad commander's plan went according to plan. Mac diverted the attention of most of the troops, and Andrew was able to set fire to the tents at this time. There was only one obstacle left. Encred had to deal with the main soldier in the ranks of the enemy, whom he had not met before. The young man got into a combat stance and prepared to attack. From his experience, the young man understood that every attack begins with a push. He needed to choose a good moment to start his movement. Meanwhile, his enemy stood in his place and gave orders to his wards. It was a very good moment to deliver an unexpected backstab. Encred found himself right in front of his enemy, who lost his vigilance and struck with his sword to cut off his head. The blade of the sword was already a few centimeters away from the man's head. At this time, he continued to issue orders loud and clear. Suddenly, the man sharply turned his head back and saw the danger behind him. He felt something sharp quickly approach his neck. Encred was simply shocked at this moment. He had already begun to celebrate the victory, but he understood that the enemy was not going to simply die in his own territory. The leader of the enemy squad was able to avoid danger at the last moment. He moved his neck literally a centimeter, and the young man's blow was unsuccessful. Encred made his last attack absolutely unsuccessful. By inertia, the young man continued to move forward, leaving the sword in front of his face. Meanwhile, the enemy remained standing behind the young man. He did not make very great efforts to avoid the inevitable death. Encred simply could not believe in such a course of events. He made a perfect attack, but was unable to hit his opponent at extremely close range. In addition, the enemy leader managed to counterattack him in a matter of seconds. A deep wound opened on the young man's right side, from which a lot of blood immediately poured out. Encred clutched his body head down. It was his most perfect lunge of the entire experience, but it proved fatal for him. Despite being wounded, the young man did not stop watching his opponent. He tried to understand who this man was. The stranger looked at his enemy and clenched his fists as hard as he could. He called the young man a weakling, unworthy to exist in the field of lightning war. Encred perfectly understood that he could not defeat this big man. His ability level was too low to cause the man any harm at all. The young man barely managed to get into the enemy camp, using several dozen attempts, so the main boss was definitely beyond his strength. Encred remembered how he was constantly getting trapped and dying in such situations, even though the enemies out there in the field were extremely weaker. The squad commander watched his wards die each time. He thought that this would be the worst thing that would come his way. However, Encred again made hasty conclusions. Now he realized that the main problem on his way was the man he met a few seconds ago. He turned out to be a new obstacle for him in the form of a wall that needs to be broken. Encred was used to problems on the way, so he was not upset at all. He managed to stop the bleeding a little on his right side. The young man slowly removed his hand from the wound, realizing that it was necessary to at least try to win the battle. Encred drew his sword before him and prepared himself to cross the fields with his men once more to reach this camp. The enemy leader stood immovably in his place, watching the young man like a dog, who would soon say goodbye to the earthly world. Suddenly, the man noticed a pleased smile on his opponent's face. This made him very angry, and he asked if he was funny in such a situation. Encred did not answer his opponent and continued to smile. He perfectly understood that sooner or later he would be able to overcome this bastard and win. The stranger immediately moved from his seat and swung his sword to attack. He threatened the young man to cut him into pieces and feed him to the dogs. Despite the obvious advantage of the opponent, Encred was not even going to retreat. He got into a combat stance and prepared to face the enemy. At the moment of the attack, the young man swung his sword over his head and thought that he needed to get at least some information about the enemy, entering into battle with him. Encred successfully blocked the opponent's blow. The opponents clashed for the first time in a blow with their swords, assessing each other's strength. Encred continued to pressure his opponent with his counterattack, but it didn't matter. The man held the blow firmly, not retreating. The squad commander was completely shocked by the development of events on the battlefield. He understood that absolutely nothing shines for him, and his death is only a matter of time. Withstanding the onslaught of his opponent, the leader of the enemy squad swung his powerful sword and was about to strike the final blow in this duel. However, the young man had his own plans on this account. At the very last moment, he managed to take a step back to avoid his untimely death. The stranger did not stop there and continued to deliver a flurry of blows trying to hit the opponent. His speed was simply incredible, as was his endurance. Encred was already at the limit of his capabilities. He managed to dodge his opponent's blows, but the open wound reminded him of himself from time to time. The young man was obviously in a losing position. He constantly saw the blade of the sword in front of him. At the last moment, he realized that he did not have time to avoid a collision. By some miracle, the commander of the reconnaissance group managed to block this opponent's blow as well. He put his sword down. A loud clank sounded on the battlefield. Encred was visibly sweating during this match. All he had to do was watch the precise and quick blows of his opponent, dodging them. The opponent did not give the young man any chance to counterattack because he was constantly pressing. He did not stop striking, testing the young man's strength. Despite the fact that Encred had so far managed to avoid direct blows, it was obvious even to the young man that the difference in strength with his opponent was simply colossal. Retreating back, the young man suddenly decided to counterattack his opponent. He took a short dagger from his pocket and threw it in the direction of his opponent. Enkrid again chose the moment when the man was as vulnerable as possible. The knife moved rapidly in the direction of the stranger who was in front of him. The man again demonstrated his mobility and ability to predict events. He only took one small step, missing the dagger behind his back. Enkrid was not at all surprised by this turn of events. He understood that the enemy is on a completely different level, and such attacks are not a problem for him. Dodging the knife, the leader of the enemy squad immediately moved from his seat and swung his sword to finally end this duel. He exposed the sharp blade of the sword right in front of him, catching the enemy by surprise. Enkrid understood that only a miracle could save him during this attack. Meanwhile, other sky soldiers tried to put out the fire. They ran in different directions with buckets of water, but the fire only flared up. Suddenly, a loud cry erupted on the battlefield, which saved the young man. The blade of the sword landed a few millimeters from the commander's head, cutting off his hair. An unknown voice in the camp announced that someone had spilled oil all over the land. The leader of the enemy squad was forced to distract himself from his duel. The reason for this was that the oil also reached the main flag, which was surrounded by bones. The soldiers could not allow the loss of their flag. One of the wards approached the man from behind and called him to him. This stranger turned out to be the platoon leader, and not everyone liked him. The man expressed his displeasure to the commander-in-chief because their flag was at stake, and he recklessly disposed of their time together. The platoon commander wanted to deal with his opponent very quickly, but after looking at the young man, he realized that this would not happen. Enkrid stood still with his sword in his hands, symbolizing that he was not going to retreat even a step, despite the risk of death. The young man continued to closely follow his enemy, expecting an attack from him. However, the man was no longer going to fight and turned to his opponent. Looking at him from under his forehead, the commander of the enemy platoon said that today he was letting the young man go, but he would meet them very soon. Having spoken his last words, the commander turned his back to the enemy and took a step forward. Enkrid remained standing still, watching the man. It was hard for the young man to believe that this was the end of their match. He did not expect that he would stay alive at all and that everything would end so easily. The platoon commander approached the flag and began to issue orders to his subordinates. The soldiers continued to fuss with buckets of water, dousing the center of their camp. Enkrid gripped the hilt of his sword tightly and thought that he would have to face his opponent anyway, so it was best to continue the duel. The young man understood that the action was as reckless as possible, but on his side was a blue artifact that allowed him to live the same day several times. That is why the commander of the reconnaissance unit moved from his place and headed in the direction of the enemy in order to learn as much as possible about him. However, this was not destined to happen today. Andrew Gardner appeared suddenly behind the commander and called him to him in an alarmed voice. The man told the young man that now was not the best time to continue the fight. Andrew advised the commander to get out of here immediately with all his companions. Enkrid made absolutely no reply and turned to face his invincible opponent again. Gardner was very angry that the young man would not listen to him. The commander of the reconnaissance unit looked at his visage and understood that he was the main problem that must be solved in the near future. At some point, the man stopped and cast his gaze in the direction of the young man. It was as if he was saying with his eyes that sooner or later death was waiting for the enemy. Enkrid remained in his place and ignored the cries of his ward. He looked back at his opponent with a cold, penetrating gaze, reading the information in his eyes. The commander nevertheless decided to listen to his charge and hid the sword in its sheath, taking one last look at his opponent. It was the best decision right now. Enkrid shouted loudly as he turned to his charges. He ordered the members of the reconnaissance squad to gather together immediately and get out of here. It was the best moment since most of the soldiers were busy with the fire. They continued to carry buckets of water and tried to extinguish the huge flames. Taking advantage of the commotion in the rival camp, the scouting unit led by Enkrid decided to climb in. Andrew kept looking behind him. Enkrid noticed that one member was missing from their squad. The young man immediately understood that he had died somewhere in the battle, and now there were only 5 of them left. Mac pulled Henry's hand and ran forward. He asked the commander if he was sure of his decision and if they would not be pursued. Enkrid understood that most of the soldiers were now busy with their banner, so he confidently answered his charge that a big chase after them was definitely not expected. Suddenly, one of the squad members stopped. Looking behind him, the commander saw the wounded Henry, who was holding his hand and writhing in pain. The man could not continue moving on his own. Meanwhile, opponents appeared behind him and began a pursuit operation. Henry's allies could not allow their partner to suffer. They immediately stood facing the man, drawing swords from their arsenal. The enemy squad was serious about catching the uninvited guests and punishing them for daring to set fire to their sacred flag. Encred immediately met the enemies with bread and salt. He delivered a powerful blow to the nose with his sword, leaving one of his opponents without a head. Mac wasn't going to spare any of his opponents either. He plunged the sword into the man's throat, leaving him to die on the ground. Andrew Garter found a second wind in himself and also joined the fight. He mercilessly slashed his opponents, brandishing a sharp sword. Realizing that the flow of enemies did not stop there, Encred ordered his wards to gather immediately and leave the others behind. Henry advised heading towards the field snakes, where the enemy would not be able to pursue them. Mac specified that it would be very difficult for them to get there themselves. Henry smiled and replied that he knew a completely safe path in the snake forest, where they would hardly be in danger in the form of wild animals. Encred completely trusted his ward and said that he relied on his hunting knowledge. The young man allowed the man to continue to pave the way on his own. Literally in a few minutes, the members of the reconnaissance unit found themselves in the snake forest. Behind them, they no longer heard a single step of an enemy soldier. Despite this, the men continued to run forward without stopping. They understood that the further they managed to run, the safer they would be. The reconnaissance unit found itself in absolutely wild nature. The Red Fox watched the guests in the wild, guiding them along the hunting path. Andrew Gardner and Mac were always in high spirits and helped everyone. Encred was infinitely grateful to the men for such a favor. Also, he could not forget about the help of Henry, whose knowledge helped them get out of the enemy's trap, reaching the snake forest completely safely. Encred also went to great lengths to save them. His body was completely covered in blood from the last fight with the enemy leader. The young man suddenly raised his hand up as the sun began to shine in his eyes. All members of the squad completely lost track of time during the task. It turned out that the members of the detachment spent the whole night in the territory of the enemy camp and could not close their eyes even for a second. The sun was slowly rising from behind the mountains. Having reached a safe path and rested a little, the squad members ran forward, fleeing from an unknown danger that could be hiding absolutely everywhere. The reconnaissance team arrived at the main headquarters in a few hours. The soldiers had already woken up and suddenly noticed how people were approaching their tents. Andrew Gardner looked completely wasted after his long journey. The same could be said about Henry, who was ready to fall asleep at any second. Returning to his native land, Encred raised his head to the sky and, closing his eyes, began to enjoy the air that the wind blew across the field. Despite the losses, the reconnaissance unit managed to survive in a difficult situation. After reaching the Allies, Henry immediately fell to the floor from absolute exhaustion. Sky soldiers did not manage to put out the flames in time. Absolutely all the sticks around their flag burned. The flag itself was also damaged. The two men arrived at the camp the morning after the night's disaster. The hooded soldier said that they needed to start training again immediately. The blonde with the scar was the commander of the company of Grey Dogs. His interlocutor said that he did not expect that the company could not cope with a bunch of petty thieves. The man himself could not believe it. The company commander sent his best soldiers here and did not expect that they would be defeated in a battle with an enemy unit. The Grey Dogs were an independent company in the Celestial Army, which were allowed to decide for themselves how to proceed in an operation. The mouth got its name from the name of an animal that lives in the mountains of the territory of the sky. The Grey Dog was distinguished by its stubbornness and ability to attach itself to the target. The animal stopped at absolutely nothing. The members of this company were the same, so they began to bear the name of Grey Dogs immediately after their creation. The company commander called his ward to him and asked him, was the leader of the enemy squad so strong that he could not be defeated? Platoon leader Mitch Harrier replied to his boss that the young man was a complete wretch, and if it weren't for the fire prepared by them, the enemy leader would be lying in the grave now. The company commander agreed that the young man was really lucky, but emphasized that luck is also a skill that is indispensable in real combat. Mitch Harrier asked his boss not to get angry. He promised the commander in a cold and confident voice that this would not happen again. Meanwhile, Encred was sitting in the ward on a low chair. He could finally get some rest after the hard day he had finally managed to get through. Encred could not stop thinking about the man who met him on the way. He wanted to continue the duel, but he chose the lives of his wards. Encred had a chance to hone his skills, but it was too late to think about it. The young man believed that their meeting would take place anyway. Mitch Harrier promised his commander that the next time he met an enemy leader, he would tear him to shreds without leaving a single living particle. Ankrid was of the same opinion. He certainly lacked skills, but with the help of the blue artifact, the young man was going to defeat his goal. While the leader of the scum squad was away on a special mission, Rem lay on his bed and tossed his axe up, entertaining himself. He grabbed his weapon and figured the commander should be back from scouting by now, but there was no news from him for several days. Rem stood up a little from his bed and looked ahead, thinking about his previous thought. Not for a minute did he stop thinking about the commander. The man suggested that the young man could even die on the battlefield. He didn't really want it because in a few days he became very good friends with him. Rem had to admit, Enkrid had gotten a lot stronger in a few days, but he still lacked the skills to 100% survive on the battlefield. The man slowly exhaled and realized that he still couldn't do anything. He could only miss the commander if he put his hooves away. At this moment, another member of the squad woke up. Rangi finally got a good night's sleep and yawned before revealing his eyes to the world. As soon as the young man opened his mouth, he immediately saw a familiar face in front of him, who met him every day and did not announce anything good. Rem looked at his squad mate with a completely cold gaze. He positioned himself in a supine position, as if Rangi owed him something. The young man immediately did not like the behavior of the big man. In an arrogant voice, he asked his partner why he was staring at him with his eyes. Rem raised his right hand up and showed the interlocutor the middle finger. His face at this moment was completely emotionless. Rangi decided not to graze the rear and do the same. But for this, he used the middle toe on his foot because he was too lazy to raise his hand. Seeing his interlocutor's reaction, Rem smiled sinisterly. It meant that the man was bored and needed to have some fun. Taking the axe in his hands, he rushed towards his interlocutor and asked him if he did not want to die from his axe just now. Rangi immediately understood what this was leading to. The young man began to draw his sword, as it was necessary to defend himself against an inadequate partner. Meanwhile, Enkrid reported his adventures to the commander of the 4th Company. He put everything down to luck, even the fire, which was supposedly started by accident. The fairy was very surprised listening to the report of her ward. She did not really believe that everything could happen by chance in the territory of the enemy camp. Enkrid did not want to say anything more and looked at the woman with a cold look. His face was stony and did not want to continue the dialogue. Having understood this, the commander said goodbye to her ward and allowed him to rest and heal. The young man bowed low and saluted the captain. The commander of the 4th Company assumed that Enkrid would definitely do something interesting on this mission, but the result exceeded all her expectations. Enkrid was able to sneak into the lair of the enemy camp and set fire to everything there by accident. The fairy wondered who this mysterious young man really was. Enkrid left the commander's room with a not very pleased and pensive face. One of his wards, who had been on a previous mission, was already waiting for him there. Andrew Gardner apologized to the commander for his behavior in the past and thanked the fact that it was only thanks to the young man that he managed to survive. The man has completely changed his views on life. He became much nicer and more reserved. Andrew asked the interlocutor if they could meet again. Enkrid did not really want to continue the dialogue and, waving his hand, turned around and said that they would only meet on the battlefield. No more words were spoken. The members of the reconnaissance group looked in the direction of their commander, who was walking steadily away from them. Andrew Gardner stood still, clutching his sword. Mac looked in the man's direction and tried to understand what was on his mind right now. Andrew decided to bow to the commander one last time. Enkrid did not see this, but the man decided that it would not be superfluous to pay his respects. The other members of the squad decided to follow the man's example and saluted the commander, who raised the authority of their squad with a successfully completed task. The young man took confident steps forward and thought about the words of his ward. He admitted that he really had an impact on saving the lives of 4 people. However, he had to lose 2 combat units on this mission. Enkrid wondered if there was anything he could do to save those 2. After all, the young man very quickly came to the conclusion that he would lack the skills even if he wanted to save the lives of all his wards. One day repeated over and over allowed him to see beyond his capabilities. Enkrid now realized that he could not waste his power in vain. The young man still did not forget that he was aiming for the path of a knight, which he wanted to become all his life. For this, he needed to work harder every day. Enkrid understood that he would not be able to rely on his endless repetitions all his life, because absolutely anything could happen on his thorny path. Suddenly, the young man was forced to stop in front of a crowd of people who had gathered in a circle. They shouted loudly as they watched the fight in their camp. Rem smoothly moved to the street and continued the fight with his partner. It was clear from the expression on the man's face that he was enjoying the match. Meanwhile, Rangi simply had no choice but to confront his partner. He did it every day because of the very difficult nature of the big deal. With a sinister expression on his face, Rem swung his axe to strike and was about to finish off his opponent as if he was fighting him to the death. Rangi was also not going to retreat or yield to his opponent. He came in from below and swung his sword for a simultaneous strike. Ankrid was in no hurry to interrupt the duel of his wards. He carefully watched their looks and realized that he had never seen them so angry. One of the men standing next to the young man called the heroes of the duel real monsters. It was hard to believe that they even called themselves human. The members of the Scum Squad really had incredible skills. The man's eyes met before they clashed with their metal weapons. Ankrid grasped his sword and realized that his charges had taken him lightly from the start, pitying him in their sparring matches. The young man looked confidently ahead and promised himself to make his charges make the same faces when they sparred with him. Two psychopaths collided in a blow, and a loud clank sounded on the battlefield. After this clash, it was unclear who had the upper hand. Suddenly, Rangi noticed a familiar face behind him. He immediately stopped fighting and looked at the young man in the crowd with surprise. The commander of the scumbag squad arrived on the battlefield, but for some reason did not interrupt the battle. This seemed very strange because this was his immediate task. Rem was also surprised to see the young man. He told him that he could at least report his arrival instead of silently watching their duel. Rem swung his axe and ordered the watchers to disperse immediately. Rangi asked the commander if he was all right. Ankrid replied that everything was fine. Immediately after that, the young man proceeded to analyze the match of his wards and began to ask questions. Rem refused to answer and advised the young man to take a shower and get some rest. After receiving a negative response from the big man, the squad leader switched to Rang and asked him to show him his latest attack. Rangi looked at his commander with surprised eyes and said that he really needs to rest because his external condition makes others feel it. Ankrid did not understand at all what the man meant. He felt completely normal, but for some reason he received similar advice from his wards. After the dialogue, Rangi turned his back to the interlocutor and headed for the ward. Ankrid had the feeling that the man wanted to tell him something. He looked carefully after his ward and tried to understand what he meant. In the end, it didn't matter to him, because Rangi is an eternal philanderer. The battalion commander learned about the enemy ambush very quickly and immediately deployed all the infantry closer to the field where the high grass was located. Ankrid managed to heal his wounds during the training. In his free time, he studied strategy on the battlefield or simply practiced with his sword. One evening, sitting by the fire, Ankrid gathered somewhere. Kreis asked the commander if he had decided to train again. Members of the detachment poured themselves dinner. Rangi was simply shocked because the young man has not yet had time to recover, but is already trying to wriggle out of himself. Ankrid spent the evening training and returned to the ward. The morning of the next day came very quickly. The sun rose above the horizon and began to shine brightly. As always, Rangi was the last to wake up. He opened his eyes and began to curse the world for not allowing a person to peacefully enjoy his sleep. Looking at the commander's bed, the man saw that there was no one there. He immediately assumed that the young man, neither the world nor Zoraya, had gone to morning training. Rangi stretched his body towards the ceiling and flexed his muscles. The man yawned one last time before leaving his cot. After that, it was necessary to get up and start doing something. Suddenly, unexpected thoughts came to the man about his dreams and goals in the past. Holding the weapon in his hand and looking at his sword, Rangi remembered that he had a talent for swordsmanship since he was a child, so he hardly practiced it. Becoming stronger was very easy for a man, so he set himself the goal of becoming a knight and strode towards her as he was striding out of the chamber now. Rangi soon lost interest in his goal. Even now, the young man left the room and yawned because he was very bored. Glancing at the branches of the trees, Rangi asked himself why he even needed the title of knight when he could just be here and enjoy life. In fact, the man simply lost his purpose and began to stomp in place without admitting it. Suddenly, he stopped and saw someone training outside the camp. This young man turned out to be the commander of a squad of scumbags. He honed his sword-striking skills, slicing through the air in front of him again and again. The last blow was not very successful for the commander. The consequences of the last mission made themselves felt. The young man's back strained after the last blow. He decided to rest a little and threw the sword on the floor, clutching his right side. At this time, Rangi was standing near the tent and watching the young man. Ankrid wanted to recover as soon as possible, but it was not so easy to do. His wound was quite deep and prevented him from moving normally. Observing the commander's movements, Rangi concluded that the young man had been training incorrectly from the very beginning, as he had not been able to master the basics of swordsmanship. The man knew very well that it is almost impossible to achieve great skill without the basics. In his opinion, the commander was simply using his free time. Encred was of a completely different opinion than his ward. Despite the pain in his right side, the young man still got up and took the sword in his hands. His eyes lit up with a dream, and he was going to continue training. Encred was used to constant difficulties, so he was not going to just give up. Rangi watched the young man with surprise. He couldn't understand why he kept getting up and pushing himself to the point of exhaustion. It was impossible for anyone to understand, except for Encred, who did not abandon his dream and continued to train in order to achieve his goal sooner or later. Suddenly, the commander was forced to interrupt his training after hearing a strange voice. Rangi approached the young man and asked why he needed it. Encred turned to face the interlocutor and looked at him askance. The young man gave a clear and comprehensive answer that he wanted to become stronger. Rangi understood perfectly well that the commander wanted to become stronger, but he wanted to know why he wanted it. Encred said he wanted to become a knight. Rangi was a little surprised and expressed his opinion that a knight is only one who is good with a sword, asking the interlocutor what that means. Encred did not judge his ward for his opinion and explained that he had his own views on the fate of the knight he wanted to become in the future. Rangi listened attentively as the commander talked about the weak and hopeless people, whom the knight of his dreams is obliged to help with everything he can. Encred held his sword high and said that he wanted to become a knight of honor to stand up for the things that every wielder of iron weapons holds dear. Rangi was still looking at his interlocutor in surprise. He heard such an answer for the first time in his life, and memories from the past woke up in him. Rangi remembered how many men on his path spoke only of the physical strength that a knight should possess. However, Encred turned out not to be like that. Suddenly the man asked himself what he wanted to be in this life. He wanted to know what the word knight meant, or sword, or perhaps war. Rangi understood very well that he would not be able to find out until he was at least on some path in his life. The man took a confident step forward. Encred had already turned his back to the interlocutor and continued training. Rangi apologized and once again interrupted his commander's practice. Encred was not very happy about this, but agreed to spend a few more seconds on the conversation. He looked at the interlocutor, expecting him to continue. Rangi killed his commander for a reason. Stepping towards the young man, the man asked if he wanted to learn how to wield a sword for real. Encred looked at his ward with surprised eyes and did not understand the question a little. Naturally, he replied that he wanted to learn how to wield a sword perfectly. For a while, there was silence between the interlocutors. The commander looked at the man and did not understand why he started the conversation at all. Rangi was lost in his thoughts and did not know how to continue the dialogue. He was not very fond of oratory, like all his partners. When the man stuttered, he immediately felt a little awkward and looked up at the sky. He assumed that the commander would not want to learn at all. However, Rangi wasn't going to back down from what he had, as he wanted to rediscover his true purpose through training with the commander. He looked at the confident look of the young man and understood that his eyes said that he would definitely not be bored. Rangi asked if the savage taught any of his techniques. Encred replied that Ram had trained him in the beast heart technique. The man did not like it very much. He said that this would be the main problem. Extending his hand in front of him, Rangi said that the commander should forget all the techniques he had learned. Encred clarified, "I will have to even forget the technique of Valen's mercenary." Having understood what was being discussed, Rangi said that the technique should be forgotten first of all. The man explained that during a real fight, the young man will simply forget the new techniques and start using the old ones, because it is much more convenient for him. Rangi offered the young man to immediately choose one of the ways, to renounce all the acquired knowledge and gain new ones, or to continue living like this. At first glance, it was a very difficult choice. However, everything seemed much more obvious to Encred, and he confidently answered that he wanted to learn new things. Rangi did not expect to receive such a quick response. He thought that the young man would start thinking about the proposal, but he was wrong. The man looked at the commander with a frightened look and asked if he seriously wanted to give up everything he had learned throughout his life. Encred gave a clear answer. He could do without words. Everything was written in his eyes. The young man asked where they would start. Rangi started going crazy from the very first lesson with his student. He called the commander a crazy person because a healthy person would definitely not have chosen this path. First of all, the man said that the commander needed to change his weapon. He gave him his sword as his own was too light for the art of fencing. Rangi told his disciple to grasp the hilt of the sword, placing his right hand higher than his left. Encred clearly followed the teacher's order and grabbed the sword. The man asked the young man why he gripped the handle so tightly. Encred replied that he simply did not want to drop the weapon on the ground. When Rangi asked the captain who taught him this, he said it was Rem. Rangi shook his head and called his wild monkey partner. Keeping his emotions to himself, the man switched to the captain and told him to stand up. Enkred was a little surprised because he already had the sword in his hand. Suddenly, the young man saw danger behind him. His current teacher suddenly got up from his seat and stepped into his back to strike. Enkred certainly wasn't going to just miss the punch. He immediately blocked the blow with his sword, engaging in the first duel with Rangi. After the collision with the opponent, the captain felt incredible pain in his hands. His sword seemed to pulse and transmit impulses to his own body. Enkred asked his teacher why he struck so painfully. Rangi reassured the commander and said that this was an integral part of the training. The man explained that the young man could break his wrist if he held the sword so hard. He compared it to a log, still standing motionless in place. Enkred glanced sideways at his charge and realized that all the members of his squad were not very eloquent given their ridiculous comparisons. The young man immediately began to search for meaning in these words and realized that he needed to become more flexible in order to add more maneuverability to unexpected attacks. Enkred held his sword in front of him and tried to relax his hands a little. At first glance, he succeeded in everything, but subsequent fights showed the opposite. Rangi attacked again from his commander. Behind the camp, only the loud sounds of metal weapons hitting each other could be heard. Enkred felt like a schoolboy on the battlefield. Rangi kept pointing out his mistakes, one of which was keeping the center of gravity. The commander tried his best, pulling the socks on his feet. He could only concentrate on one detail, but this was a disadvantage on the battlefield. Rangi continued to throw blows and noticed that the young man was still holding his hands tightly around the handle, which could cause an inevitable broken arm. The man constantly insulted his student, calling his fight dancing. Enkred was already tired of constant comparisons and began to get angry with his ward. Training under the scorching sun continued for several hours. The commander set himself the goal of mastering fencing and was not going to back down. Many sparring matches turned out to be completely one-sided. Rangi was constantly winning the matches while the captain found himself lying on the ground. Rangi looked at his student and could not even think that he would turn out to be so incapable. Enkred didn't even have an idea of the basics of swordsmanship. The young man sat as dissatisfied and exhausted as possible, looking down. Rangi was well aware that the training would be very long. Enkred was breathing very heavily. A river flowed from him from incredible exhaustion. The commander was at the limit of his capabilities, training for several hours. Despite this, the young man did not even think about putting down his weapon. He constantly stood up and took the sword in his hands again, showing his stubbornness. Rangi wondered why the young man stood up at all. Just in front of his eyes, Enkred kept getting up and looking into his eyes. The master of the sword was ready to admit that his student was completely inept, but his tongue did not return to do so because of the stubbornness and determination of the commander. Having put the sword in front of him, Endrik again stood in a fighting stance and told the teacher that he was ready to try to master swordsmanship one more time. Rangi drew air into his lungs and slowly exhaled. He understood that these skills were too difficult for a commander, so he needed to try something else. Agreeing to another sparring session, Rangi said he would give in a bit, as the man looked like he needed to learn to walk again. As soon as the opponents were ready to engage in battle, they were suddenly interrupted by a familiar voice. One of the allies came to the battlefield in search of a commander. Rem did not forget to take with him the axe he carried on his shoulders. He asked the members of his squad if they had decided to play with friends all day. Pointing his axe at Rang, Rem asked the captain if he was offended by this scumbag. Rangi replied that someone would definitely be offended now. Endrik asked his wards to calm down and asked the big man if something happened, because he decided to look for him here for a reason. Rem remembered the purpose of his visit and informed the commander that an order had arrived from the company commander for an urgent call-up of the entire army. The enemy was approaching their territory, so Chris and Auden had already started to gather in tents. Rem gathered himself faster than everyone else and came to the commander. Jackson also gathered very quickly, but did not want to go searching. He just stayed in the ward, deciding to practice his hearing a little. The troops very quickly gathered on the battlefield. The leader of the 4th Company stood on a high rock, from where she could see absolutely all her charges. The Scum Squad, which was actually the strongest of the allies, arrived on the battlefield in time with a commander who brought a new sword with him. Rangi continued to think about his new student, whom he had started training in new techniques in vain, as it might prevent him from fighting at his full potential on the battlefield. In addition, the man assumed that the commander might even die. Rangi took another sword with him, which was to serve as his new weapon. The man at that moment was standing behind his captain and understood that on the battlefield, he would have to do exactly the same to protect the young man. Encred was thinking about finally testing his skills in battle and noticed the enemy units just ahead of him, lined up in a very strange way. In front of the majors was the same flag that the sky soldiers tried to protect and hide in the tall grass, but one of them burned after all. The fairy also noticed a rather strange arrangement of the enemy units. They became piles of 20 people, each of us raising a flag with them. There was hidden power in the ranks of the enemy. The man who gave orders to the company commanders arrived on the battlefield to test his new strength. When he put his left hand out in front of him, a thick fog immediately began to form around him. This man possessed magic and controlled the forces of nature. The fairy was simply shocked when she saw a wave of fog in front of her. She did not expect that the enemy would bring such a powerful mage to the battlefield. The members of the units of the fourth company could not understand what was happening at all. Some of them saw magic with their own eyes for the first time and were very scared. Encred was one of them. Unlike his fearful allies, the young man stood still and tried to understand where this fog could come from. Literally in a few seconds, the commander of the second-rate unit could no longer see even his allies in front of him. The fog was very thick. A real panic began among the ranks of the allied troops. The soldiers could not understand what was happening and how they could now continue the battle. Encred listened attentively to every sound in this impenetrable darkness. However, he managed to hear only the panicked expressions of his allies. Suddenly, absolutely every soldier on the battlefield heard very strange sounds. Soldiers of the fourth company stood in their places and asked each other about the sounds. Their questions turned into real panic in a few seconds. They understood that this did not mean anything good and began to look in different directions. Encred was the first to hear this sound. He realized that the allies were in danger and immediately notified them that arrows were flying in their direction. The training of the commander of the second-rate squad turned out to be in vain. Thanks to Jackson's skills, he was able to sense danger and report it to his allies. Despite the warning, the soldiers could not do anything about these arrows. The danger was approaching very quickly, and the Allied forces were suffering incredible losses. The commander of the fourth company also received several arrows in his direction. She heard the young man's message in time, so she was able to repel the arrows. After that, the fairy shouted loudly, ordering her wards to prepare for the next wave and raise their shields for protection. The man who brewed this porridge stood in his position and choked with laughter. He took incredible pleasure in suffering in the rear of their enemies. The magician spent several years mastering this technique and finally managed to catch his opponent by surprise. Now it was only a question of the skill of the archers. In addition, the man could give his allies the ability to see in the fog, which allowed his wards to attack the enemy unilaterally. It was simply an incredible technique that was difficult to defend against. The commander of the fourth company did not even imagine how it was possible to overcome the opponents now. Suddenly, the platoon commander approached the sorcerer from behind, noticing the man's satisfaction. The magician replied that he had finally succeeded in perfecting the technique. The commander remained standing in his place and suddenly heard from the man how he mumbled disgruntledly about one extra soldier in the ranks of the enemy. Mitch Harrier immediately understood who his ally was talking about. He was able to see through the fog and burned his target with a murderous gaze. The men spoke of a second-rate unit commander who alerted the allies to the danger. Encred held the blow firmly, holding the sword in front of him.